Hello and welcome back to Analogia Entis. I'm joined today by my friend Mr. J. Johnson to discuss his study of my channel's namesake, the analogy of being. Jay is an independent writer and researcher with an expertise beyond his years in the arenas of theology, philosophy, and metaphysics. He discovered my work from his intensive reading of the 20th century Catholic master Erich Przywara and his 1932 magnum opus entitled Analogia Entis, Original Structure and Universal Rhythm, that identifies Jewish messianism as the substrate of modern errors. In my own research on analogy, I have avoided Przywara's classic work because it vastly exceeds my reading level. Thankfully, J. Johnson has tirelessly fielded my questions as I've attempted to read this gauntlet of a text and has prepared a presentation on Przywara's life and thought entitled Reductio and Mysterium, Between God and Nothing, that he will be sharing today. According to Przywara, the Analogia Entis is the fundamental Catholic form that obtains between God and creature. Along this path, the crisis of the West erupts from the suppression of this original structure and how it clarifies God's relationship to the world and subsequently the rights owed to him. Dialogue and relationality. The I-thou becomes paramount when the analogy of being has been rejected. Man replaces God from both sides. A participatory metaphysics of creator and creature is replaced by a set of dialectical negations and syntheses that always end up placing man at the helm. How does creation issue from God and return to him? The disputation of this question by the Kabbalists has been a central focus of my channel, but the heretical postures of the Protestants, Gnostics, Neoplatonists, and modern atheists swirl around the same issue. Where is God in this system? How do cosmogony and eschatology flow from him? These metaphysical and thus metapolitical questions presuppose all questions. The analogical form that mitigates between essence and existence, God and creature, immanence and transcendence, theology and metaphysics, ontology and epistemology, being and becoming, is the only way to answer these foundational queries without violating the law of non-contradiction. As Przywara indicates, the Analogia Entis and the law of non-contradiction are inextricable. Przywara has much to say about the coincidence of opposites as well. As I've opposed analogy and dialectic in the past, Przywara's appraisal is more precise. He distinguishes contradiction from complementarity because, after all, Christ is Alpha and Omega, beginning and end, judgment and mercy, east and west, above and below, in us and beyond us, so that our participation in him can only be described as a unity in tension, a dynamic polarity. Left is the contrary of right, but does not contradict it. Przywara distinguishes complementarity from the dialectic of contradiction, where every opposition is a negation of the other. Justice and mercy are contraries united in God, but he is not good and evil, because there is no change in him who lacks nothing. Privation is not the contrary of being, but its contradiction. Non-being doesn't exist except in relation to being as a shade and a degree of attribute. While the Analogia Entis conveys a positive cataphatic affirmation of the possibility of knowing God through analogy, it is ultimately apophatic in character in that it places the greater stress on the difference between divine and creaturely existence and knowledge. The cataphatic affirms divine presence, but even more so, the apophatic safeguards divine mystery. As Przywara repeatedly emphasizes, it rests on the definition of the Fourth Lateran Council that between creator and creature there can be noted no similarity so great that a greater dissimilarity cannot be seen between them. Thus, the fundamental premise of the Analogia Entis is that God indeed reveals himself in finite creation, yet infinitely surpasses that revelation. According to St. Augustine, God is nearer to us than we are to ourselves, yet surpasses all distance. The infinite is here, everywhere, and beyond all at once. Now, then, before and after, in and outside time, palpable and ineffable. In him there is no change or shadow of turning, and the darkness cannot comprehend it. As St. Augustine said, for Almighty God would never have created any nature at all whose defect he foresaw, if he had not known at the same time how it would be placed in the order of things, or the beauty of the universe would be made complete by its contrasts. For just as the oppositions of contraries set off the beauty of speech, so also the oppositions of contraries serve to enhance the beauty of the universe. The similarity by which God's goodness is likened to ours, according to Przywara, is surpassed by an even greater dissimilarity in which all goodness is predicated in the same quality in God, yet infinitely falls short. God is good and can bring good from evil, but no evil is in him, nor his complement. Light shines brighter amid the dark, but does not proceed from it. Instead, evil, darkness, and privation exist merely as degrees of separation from the source of being. Yet in the thought of Hegel, Heidegger, Luria, and Schneerson, they present as the very ground, the Umgrund, from which being springs as its necessary precondition. In studying Erich Przywara's work, it is striking to see how many of the same subjects I've explored in this channel appear in his formulation of the Analogia Entis, such as crisis or Weimar theology, Karl Barth and Martin Buber, the theology of dialogue, the law of non-contradiction, the coincidence of opposites, Kabbalah and Jewish messianism, Joachim de Fiore, Simone Weil, and the 20th century theology of kenosis. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jay. Welcome, Jay. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Will. It's great to actually be on the channel after having watched so many of your videos. So being on this side of things is a little bit different. Backstage is pretty nice.
Well, it's a pleasure, and it's been a pleasure working with you and learning from you. You're a fountainhead.
Thank you very much. Glory be to God. So the intention of this series, which we've entitled Reductio and Mysterium, Between God and Nothing, is to take a look at these two individuals here, two Jesuits in early 20th century Germany, Father Erich Przywara and Husserl von Balthasar. We're going to look at both of them at first individually and then in a comparison, which will occur throughout. The idea is to look at first in this initial part the thought of Erich Przywara, the role that the Analogia Entis plays in his thought, and the way that he formulates the Analogia Entis. And then in part two, look at how the Analogia Entis appears in Husserl von Balthasar, the way that he leverages it, and importantly, the deviations that he takes, the liberties that he takes regarding theology that he differs from his former mentor and teacher, Erich Przywara. And I'd like to first begin with a quote from Father Przywara about the Analogia Entis. The creature, in the I am of the factical unity of its being, bears a true likeness to the I am of the essential unity of divine being, but then this is also the fulcrum of the concrete relation between God and not God, and that the mystery of the supernatural incarnation reaches its critical climax in the question concerning the being of Christ. For on the one hand, the one divine person as one substance also stipulates the one divine essay of Christ. As Aquinas wrote, one simple being on account of the one eternal being of the suppositum. On the other hand, the reality of Christ's humanity at the same time includes the being of his humanity as a second essay, though not accidental, in the mode of a new relation of the pre-existent personal being to human nature. It thus becomes evident how, even in precisely in its distinctiveness, the analogy proper to Thomas Aquinas' thought culminates in the Analogia Entis. The Entis signifies so great a separation between God and creature, that there is no common genus whatsoever between them. If an agency is not in any genus, then the likeness is only according to a certain analogy, inasmuch as being is itself common to all. But even so, it is precisely here that at the root a radically positive unity is declared. Those things that come from God, inasmuch as they are beings, are likened to him as to the first and universal principle of all being. Father Erich Przywara is writing this in 1932 in his great work, the Analogia Entis, which is where he puts forward the argument for the analogy of being most prominently. And it is here that we can see in this quote one of the main pillars of his argument, which is that the Analogia Entis, or the analogy of being, is the fundamental Catholic form. He's saying that it is latent in the doctrine of the Church, St. Thomas Aquinas. He sees this as not merely something that is present in a few of the church doctors, not a few of the church fathers, but rather it is universal in Catholicism. It's actually one of the great teachings of the Catholic Church. It is necessary for not only Christianity, but also for a coherent metaphysics at all, a coherent philosophy, a coherent theology. It all requires the analogy of being. To look at Father Erich Przywara first and understanding who he is, obviously he's a philosopher and theologian, and it's important to recognize the way that he is received by a number of different figures. So he's often brought up alongside Husserl von Balthasar, he's brought up alongside Karl Rahner. Both of these individuals, von Balthasar and Rahner, were Jesuits in Germany at one point in time. They studied under Przywara. He was never a professor in Germany because they didn't have seminaries in Germany. But while he taught in Munich, he taught courses, he offered the Mass, and it was there that they became acquainted with him as he was the editor for a major Jesuit publication. Przywara was also an interlocutor with Karl Barth. It's here that he has a relationship with von Balthasar as well, because the three of them formed a discussion circle with Przywara representing a thoroughly Catholic position, Karl Barth representing a thoroughly Lutheran Reformed position or Protestant position, and then von Balthasar trying to be ecumenical as always in between them. And Przywara lastly is often brought up alongside Edith Stein or St. Teresa Benedict of the Cross, as he was instrumental in her conversion. He was the one that told her to translate Aquinas out of the Latin. Being a Jesuit in the early 20th century Germany, he is responsible for a number of publications himself. He wrote hundreds of articles, almost 1,000 articles, and he wrote over 50 books. They're scarcely reprinted out of German, and it's often said that they collect dust in Jesuit libraries. They aren't often reprinted out of German. He was very well known in his time, and he spans an important transition point for philosophy and history in general. He was born in a city that was in Germany at the time, later given to Poland by the Treaty of Versailles, and he died shortly after Vatican II. One thing that he's known for, and this is a major part of his legacy, is that he was one of the first philosophers to critically engage with modern philosophy as a Catholic. This is not simply that he outright dismissed it, not that he was simply borrowing from it, or that he was trying to reconcile the two, but that he was critically engaged. He praised it in some places, and he refuted it in others. This is one of the reasons why his legacy is so fought over. And many articles that are published about him now, many books that are published about him now, there is a sense that Przywara is in the middle of a tug of war between those who see him as a prototype for Karl Rahner, some who see him as totally aligned with von Balthasar, and all sorts of other figures in which he's incorporated into a more general milieu. For our purposes, we're going to look at the way that Przywara presents himself, and then understanding him in a couple contemporary idioms that will make it easier to understand his thought. Now, while he's most known for his formulation of the Analogia Entis, he's also recognized for being master of a number of different disciplines. Not that he was, for instance, a phenomenologist himself, he was not, but that he would engage with phenomenology with a thorough understanding of phenomenology. And whenever someone would criticize him from outside the Catholic faith, or even within it, they never disputed the fact that he was perceptive, that he was very intellectual, that he was precise. Now, speaking of criticism, one of the criticisms that he's most known for, one of the criticisms of him that he's most known for, is the one that Karl Barth directs at him. The repudiation that Karl Barth has for the Analogia Entis is actually towards Przywara himself. Przywara was engaged with reviews of Karl Barth's work and a few other of the dialectical theologians. On the Protestant side, he was writing articles criticizing, but also praising them in some places, such as saying that they're, for one instance, thoroughly Protestant. They understand the protest in the first place. And to that extent, Przywara is understanding Barth's position truly. He says that as much in the letter to one of his colleagues, saying that this is a Jesuit who understands what we're actually arguing. However, it was in the late 1920s that, and not having read the book itself, that Karl Barth says that regarding the Analogia Entis, it must be the invention of the Antichrist, that any other reasons for not becoming Catholic must be trivial in comparison. So you could say that in the criticism that Karl Barth has for the Analogia Entis and for Catholicism generally, the invention of the Antichrist in this case, for him would be Erich Przywara. Now, this kind of vitriol is almost more or less a one-off, because Karl Barth does in 1929 invite him to two of his lectures, and even has him over his dinner, or over his house for dinner with his family on one occasion before he leaves Germany due to political pressures. Now, as I said, Hans Urs von Balthasar is often the figure that's brought up most, or rather, Przywara is brought up alongside von Balthasar the most. And for good reason, too. Von Balthasar has quite a number of positive things to say about his former mentor and teacher. He says on one occasion that he was the greatest spirit I was ever permitted to meet. Although Przywara is not really quoted that much in von Balthasar's work directly. As a matter of fact, he appears very scarcely in his work. One of the few times that von Balthasar offers a substantive review of something that he says is that he has in mind a scripture passage, which this review of Przywara will work fine for generalizing what von Balthasar had to say about Przywara. Like everyone who encounters the living God and is called to proclaim him, Przywara was more than simply a thinker. If with one half of his being he was such a sharp and implacable thinker like no other in his time, this was simply the way that he fulfilled the appalling duty to use weapons of divine power to destroy strongholds, to unmask sophistries, to raise every high tower that would exalt itself against the knowledge of God, to take every thought captive to obedience to Christ, citing 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 4 through 5. So this, and coupled with a few other things that von Balthasar has to say about Erich Przywara, make for a pretty positive appraisal of his former mentor. However, he is, in very rare circumstances, critical of him, and one of the most notable is the statement that it is of no accident that Przywara never produced a Christology, and here he's referencing the Analogia Entis specifically. Now, Przywara himself, he spoke seldom about von Balthasar in return. They did have a relationship after von Balthasar left for Switzerland, and for a period of time they were correspondents, although Przywara, for various reasons, had reservations on his side. Von Balthasar presumably had reservations on his side as well towards Przywara that he did not express often publicly. Przywara only reviewed von Balthasar's work briefly, and one of the few occasions where he did write something that was actually cutting and substantial is included in the most recent translation of the 1932 Analogia Entis. The most recent translation is from Erdmann's by Dr. John Betts and Dr. David Bentley Hart. And the article that Przywara is writing this in is from 1940. So bear in mind, 1940, this is while von Balthasar is still a Jesuit. This is before von Balthasar is really deeply immersed with the mystic that he would later be associated with, Adrian von Speer. And this is also before he writes much of Theodramatique or Glory of the Lord. This is truly the work that, this is really when he only has Apocalypse of the German Soul and a few other tentative works before he's fully developed his theology. This is what Przywara has to say. Over against this entire group, Hans von Balthasar essentially employs a complete method of analogy and opposes it to the form of contradiction identity in virtually the same way as I do in my work vis-a-vis Hegel. Now, bear in mind here, Analogia Entis used against contradiction identity is a way of saying that the way that von Balthasar is leveraging the Analogia Entis is to oppose Hegel and the identity contradiction synthesis in Hegel, which von Balthasar is known for, which he's known for opposing. So in this regard, Przywara is saying that it's virtually the same in criticizing Hegel using the analogy of being in that way. Continuing. However, from the first volume of his Apocalypse onward, one hears a double emphasis. On the one hand, the existential emphasis upon a flowing with the flow of the world, the highest law of reality. On the other hand, the essential emphasis upon a suspension of the image, demythologizing. To look at this for just a second, these are very airy and offhanded allusions to Origin of Alexandria. The flowing with the flow of the world and the suspension of the image are both have to do with the catechetical school of Alexandria and a few other philosophers and theologians from that period in time. And what he's essentially arguing here, Przywara is arguing here, is that there's a double emphasis, there's a echo of these ideas found in his use of the analogy of being, and his entire philosophy that he's putting forth has something to do with this originist idea, which he'll expand on in just a second. The first being a subdued version of the Dionysian, in other words, Bacchus, the second a subdued version of the mythical, though the mythical, as suspended, is ultimately subordinated to the Dionysian, existentialism and essentialism, an existential infinity of a subdued Dionysianism in Paul Claudel's sense. Paul Claudel, the Catholic playwright and dramatist, and an essential finitude of the mythical, and thus a rhythmic identity with God, because it is an existential infinity. Balthasar, therefore, logically says no to the origin of pneumatic ascent and to the dissolution of the earthly form of the image into pure spirit, but he says yes to the origin of the Dionysian vitality of an earthly life and fire. So what we have here is a rather interesting and cryptic criticism of von Balthasar, and this is very characteristic of Przywara's style, which we'll see going forward as we read quotes from him. Now here what we have is an interesting allusion to the Dionysian, and that's not Dionysius the Areopagite, that is Dionysus, as in Bacchus, the Greek god of wine. He also, Przywara is referencing Origen when regarding von Balthasar's work, and he's saying that there is a yes and no to Origen. There is a yes to what he calls an earthly life and fire, the Dionysian vitality, which he identifies as being existential. But in regards to the essential aspect of Origen, which is a pneumatic ascent and dissolution of the earthly form into the image of pure spirit, he says that von Balthasar rejects this aspect of Origen. Now these are interesting because they, in a sense, coincide with the criticisms that von Balthasar has for Przywara. That seems like their point of contention is mutually agreed upon. Von Balthasar thinks that Przywara doesn't have a groundwork for the incarnation. He says that much when he says that his version of the Analogia Entis can't account for Christology, can't account for incarnation. Przywara thinks that von Balthasar has gone into something that is Dionysian mythical. We'll see in a little bit as we're going through this video that this criticism that he has regarding the Dionysian and the mythical is the inverse of what von Balthasar says about Przywara here. The whole point of this video in analyzing Przywara will be to unpack this criticism. Is going to find out by the end of this video what exactly he means by this. What's opaque now will be clear by the end. And the guiding question I want to look at throughout this entire series: how did von Balthasar stray from Erich Przywara, and why? To get a sense of what we're actually doing here and what the work that we're trying to accomplish here is, it would be good to look at the setting that Przywara and von Balthasar are enculturated. They wouldn't use that word enculturated, but their work is in response to something. It's historically contextualized, so it would be good to understand what they're actually responding to, what vocabulary they're using, and who they're actually talking to. They probably belong to a specific time and place, and in Germany in a very transitional time, as we saw. Remember, Przywara is born in a place that is going to be given over to Poland in very short order, and he is living in Germany during one of the most tumultuous times in its history, and then he will pass away shortly after Vatican II. This is certainly a period of disruption and change, and so it helped to know what exactly Przywara himself is understanding as he's coming of age during the pontificate of Pius X, and as he is intellectually formed during one of the most important times in European history. You could say that this time that Przywara, and then after him by about 16 years, von Balthasar existed, is the period that ends modernity and inaugurates postmodernity. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the Enlightenment period at this point in time is coming to a close. To put it into purely historical terms, what happened after the Napoleonic Wars in Europe was a complete shift in the understanding of states and governments. States were no longer going to be defined strictly by the ethnic ties that they had, the things that are that concretely grounded in a people and a place. Napoleon had a much different vision for his empire, and what was shown through the Napoleonic Wars and in the period of buildup between that and the First World War is that nations that follow the previous order of Westphalian nation states of self-contained classical political entities were not going to survive. The way that nations were going to survive was going to be through following Napoleon's example, becoming like a Napoleonic France rather than defending themselves against it. And the development of cities and urban centers into this new form were during the Industrial Revolution was going to play a critical aspect in these new forms of state. This form of state is the kind of state that allows something like Bolsheviks to take power and recategorize and reclassify Russia from having czars into having a communist dictatorship, which would soon threaten Europe as a whole. And the nations and empires that were falling elsewhere, such as the Holy Roman Empire, which fell only shortly before the First World War, and then, of course, the Ottoman Empire, which itself, with it, Islam collapsed in Europe and receded from Europe for a time. The new state was going to be one where all of the ends were directed towards the purposes of the administrators of the state, not simply that politics was an effort to ensure that the common good was for the people and for the entity itself as the state was achieved, but rather that it could be directed in every single aspect, managed and governed. The Enlightenment values that we associate with someone like John Locke or Rousseau, these values of liberty and what maybe we could call individualism, are not going to play an important part for nations going forward. Even if they give lip service to these ideas, it's very clear in something like Otto von Bismarck's Reforms of Germany that this is not going to be the chief consideration. When we think about the Treaty of Versailles, this might be best classified as a last-ditch effort to retain these old values, because Germany, which is ascendant, is being punished in sort of a classical way, and it's even being used to pay for the war debts and to cripple a major player in Central Europe, which has access to both Eastern and Western Europe, preventing it from having an excess amount of influence in either direction. At the same time, there's a very abstract kind of peace that's implemented throughout Europe through the Treaty of Versailles. New nations are created sort of out of thin air with no real boundaries set by the ethnic ties. Germans are split into 6 different nation states. Czechoslovakia is formed with the Czech people and the Slovaks having very little relation to each other and no real love for each other. Ultimately, what we have is a tentative peace that is not going to work. Everyone knows that it didn't work now after the fact, but even then, many of those who were in power and those who were politically active understood that what had been created were not valid states, they were not sustainable states, and they were very politically fragile, even if they were not militarily fragile. These new concepts of state have been discussed elsewhere more thoroughly. A friend of the channel, Theo Howard, has discussed on his channel the way that finance plays an important role in the formation of these states. But for right now, we can understand, for our purposes, in this brief historical analysis, that what we're discussing here is not simply a change in the way that governments are formed, but governance itself is being thought of in a new way, and this is concomitant with the philosophical changes at the time. In addition to the technological changes and the philosophical changes, which we'll address in just a second, we have something concrete, something empirical that we can point to as really emblematic of this transition. Quantum mechanics had been developed over the course of several decades, beginning in the late 19th century and then finally in the early 20th century. The idea of particles functioning as both as having properties of both waves and particles is becoming more and more evident, to the point where it's the wave slit experiment, and then finally Heisenberg's uncertainty principle becomes more or less undeniable. What this means for classical mechanics which has already been out at this point, is that it's being revisited as something that could be potentially revised. What's certain is that Newtonian physics is completely errant. The alchemical ideas behind it, the strict materialist aspects behind it, are not viable. And it's not because they need heavy revision, it's because their ideas about space, about time, about matter, about atoms is completely flawed from the outset. Their first principles are flawed. Newton has some value, his calculus has some value, but his physics is not going to be long for this world, and especially in the mid-1920s. Why this is important for our philosophical discussion is because, as Dr. Michael Gillespie remarked in Theological Origins of Modernity, Kant is simply the philosophical half to Newton's science. It's not simply that you dispense of Newton and you dispense of Kant, but that both go out together. And Kantian philosophy is really only surviving at this point in his students and his disciples. The Neo-Kantians are struggling to synthesize him with others. You have Marischal, who within the Catholic Church is attempting to synthesize Kant with St. Thomas Aquinas. You have Neo-Kantians who are borrowing from religious sources as well, from some Christian authors, as we said with Aquinas, and with Judaism, as with Hermann Cohen. And we also have a number of Kant's students, obviously Hegel being one of them, who Kant is seeing revision through them. And the inner contradictions of Kant are becoming more evident, the contradictions between a passive collective and then the triumph of the individual. But even these students themselves, Hegel, as a successor to Kant, is heavily revised, and his own first principles are in question. His own phenomenology is being completely overturned by questions raised by Edmund Husserl in a major turn towards the object. But Hegel himself is not even held in an unqualified sense. He's surviving mainly through his students such as Feuerbach and Marx as one example. And then social science, which had only erupted in the late 19th century, was already needing its own revisions through its own revisions of Comte and others who have contributed to social science as something more than simply psychoanalysis. These philosophical projects, again, it is not simply that they need revision, but that their first principles are being discarded and they need to be revisited from square one. They need to be looked at with a very critical angle. And whatever truth is found can be extracted, whatever falsehoods are found can be denied. And this is an important aspect which has been recognized in the latter half of the 20th century by Alasdair MacIntyre, famously in After Virtue. He remarks in the headings of one of his chapters in that book, the Enlightenment project had to fail. Why did it have to fail? Well, the Enlightenment project was doing something that was more or less impossible. It was crafting first principles that were meant to support a Christian superstructure. You had Christian ethics, you had a Christian idea of politics, Christian idea of governance. Christendom really was supported by Christian first principles, and those were based on a concrete Catholic church that was based on Catholic ideas about anthropology and metaphysics and a host of other issues that are found in philosophy and not merely theology. Once these were swiped away, then suddenly there's a large gaping hole that needs to be filled. New first principles are put in their place by throughout a process that begins with the Scottish Enlightenment and then later the Enlightenment itself. But as MacIntyre points out in his sequel, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, this project is flawed from the start. You can't simply swap out first principles and expect the whole system to work. This itself is bringing problems into religions, to the Christian religion on the Catholic side, because within the Catholic Church, these philosophies are being imported, and they themselves are looking to change either the foundations or the self-conceptions of what it means to be Catholic in the first place. This is the modernist crisis. And though the hierarchy goes to great efforts to crack down on the ideas of modernism, and obviously with Pope St. Pius X's Pascendi encyclical, and the oath against modernism that is taken throughout places where clerics are assigned and they join seminaries. The fight against modernism is not successful. We know this now, but even at the time it was recognized it was not very successful. Those who were most zealous about fighting modernism often were not engaging with it in the same critical mind that perhaps Pope Pius X had sought from the outset. And then furthermore, the modernists who thought of themselves as bringing fresh air into the church were looking for ways that they could reformat or change the vocabulary as to avoid the condemnations of pascendi. Now, I bring up the Catholic Church here and its fight against modernism to contrast against what's going on in Protestantism, which perhaps is more of a philosophical analog to what's happening in philosophy. Within Protestantism, there is a shift towards liberal Protestantism that is evident from the 17th and 18th century to, by the time of the late 19th and early 20th century, has completely calcified in its power. It is at the apogee of its power. You could even say it's slack tide, because liberal Protestantism had been gaining ground significantly in terms of its academic and its political influence. Liberal Protestants are, of course, associated with the historical critical method and revisions on the canon, and to the degree that they are looking for ways to change the dogmas that have been held up into the 16th century, they are looking to revise those same doctrinal formulations and even rejecting whole pieces of church history in a ever-receding abyss that leads to ultimately a kind of agnosticism that is warned about in Pius X's Pascendi. Now, one of the figures I think embodies this liberal Protestantism the best is Adolf von Harnack, who's pictured here. Von Harnack is noted for quite a few things. He's a recipient of a number of projects within biblical criticism and Christian criticism. For instance, the Nestle-Aland text was released the first critical edition of the Greek New Testament, the Nestle-Aland text, was released only a few decades before. And it opened up an avenue for biblical criticism in a way that was completely fresh and able to basically change what Scripture was saying from a very fundamental point of view. What did the first Christians actually believe? Well, you can change even what the text says because there's no longer a received text. It's really the earliest forms of the text that you can possibly dig up in the desert. And Adolf von Harnack is doing something similar with Christian history. What von Harnack is interested in is looking at what did the first Christians believe and how was it rooted in the Judaism at the time. And it leads him to condemn famously anything that has a remote taste of Hellenism. So he believes that the church was so thoroughly Hellenized by the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century that even though it was, he believes, done in perhaps earnest faith, that it needs to be rejected because it's not true Christianity. Obviously, he has a lot of problems with the New Testament for that reason, being written in Greek itself, and that's why he does things like reject John's Gospel as being too Hellenized. Now, in contrast to von Harnack's project, you have an issue, or you have a group and an organization that is brought up alongside liberal Protestantism, and that is found in dialectical theology and Weimar theology, also called crisis theology, which is re-examining the protest of Protestantism. Again, this is Karl Barth, this is Bernison, and several other figures that are well known for their approach to theology, which is looking at not only how are we different than the Catholics, how are we different than the liberal Protestants, but also thinking about how are creatures different than God. It is this form of theology that's going to shape Protestantism going into the 20th century, which makes Karl Barth one of the most important figures for Protestants in that century. Now, for reasons that will only become clear as you investigate this problem, these are all problems that are centered around Germany. Some historians go as far as to call this the nerve center for the transition, and there's various reasons why this might be. German culture has a certain life and philosophical and theological life that is only understood by Germans themselves, but it also happens that, speaking strictly in terms of geography and demographics, it has a very interesting position at this time. Germany is broken up among several different states. There's migrations of many different peoples going into and out of Germany. It has its own unique and distinctive history, and it's very difficult to completely discard the fact that Germans themselves have certain attitudes towards these types of problems, and the developments that are taking place in the scientific realm, the poetic realm, the theatrical realm, the musical realm. These are all in German tradition sort of conjoined together. It's not as easy to disentangle these disciplines from one another. We ought to recognize Germany not as a single state at this time. Again, this is a group of people, and this includes a number of people that aren't even necessarily ethnic Germans. You have Poles could be considered a part of this group, people in Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland. It's really a language group as opposed to strictly being a particular, race of people in Europe. They are forming the center of this problem. So if you're an armchair historian, you're likely to know that after the First World War, Germany divided up among several states as a punitive measure. These people took with them this heritage of German thought, and that's why in all these different realms, scientific, technological, philosophical, they're bringing with them these same ideas as part of their linguistic tradition and their cultural tradition, which travels, of course, by language. Now, thinking about some of these scientific and philosophical changes, let's mention a second Edmund Husserl, who is, of course, he's German in the sense that he speaks German, but he also has an interesting position as being raised culturally German, but also being of Ashkenazi descent and living in Germany in a rather insecure position during this period of time. He describes what's called the crisis of the European man. Now, nearly all philosophical developments out of Germany in the 20th century can trace back to what Husserl is describing here, which is he calls the project of phenomenology. Phenomenology is a term that's coined, or it's at least popularized by Hegel. Husserl is recontextualizing this idea, or rather he's renovating this idea and reinvigorating this idea that we can know more about essences themselves and the first acts of being themselves through different acts of not necessarily intuition, but understanding it scientifically or empirically based on our own understanding of our thought process. This is very important because the whole problem that is taking place in Europe at this time, as we saw just a moment ago, is that there are no solid grounds, no solid foundations for thought or for politics, for science. The whole project that was found wanting in every single other discipline, Husserl is bringing to the context of philosophy itself, and understanding that what is needed in philosophy is something that he calls a scientific philosophy. Now, his own insecurity, as I mentioned, with his status in Germany, it does come to a head because one of his students becomes his, you could say, successor, and becomes really the face of 20th century philosophy, and that is a man known as Martin Heidegger. Heidegger, really, when I say that Husserl is the one who instigates a lot of these changes, he's part of course, again, the philosophical movement, this philosophical dissatisfaction that is throughout Europe, and much of philosophy is a reaction to Husserl at this point in time. Heidegger really characterizes what it means to do philosophy in the 20th century. Without much exaggeration, many philosophers who are simply approaching problems in analytic philosophy or in existentialism, for instance, are going to be taking Heidegger's approach, even consciously or unconsciously, and he's also highly influential in theology. A number of theologians are going to ape Heidegger in that extent. in his process of demythologizing and working through philosophical problems, theological problems, with a goal to understand how things in multiplicity can exist as beings, letting beings be, the Dasein. Now, Heidegger, I said, takes over Husserl's positions and really is the one that takes philosophy, German philosophy, into a particular direction. And he really doesn't have many rivals for that claim of defining 20th century philosophy. And really, there are very few individuals that can claim to hold such a place. However, he is contrasted with other figures of this time who also have, you could say, even more influence than Heidegger does, or at least less notable influence for how widespread their influence is. This can be analyzed within Weimar theology, especially discerning the trends of Protestantism, though it's not limited to Protestantism. What we're describing here is existentialism generally, a systematic and existentialist push which is taking place with figures like von Balthasar. Again, what Przywara mentioned in his criticism regarding von Balthasar's own existential affinity. There's echoes of it in Eastern Orthodoxy with Sergei Bulgakov. Perhaps he's perhaps the most influential theologian for the Eastern Orthodox since Gregory Palamas. However, this is most in tandem with the collocation of dialogue with the philosophical category of what's called Jewish existentialism and Jewish messianism. The hallmarks of Jewish messianism, especially from the minds like Hermann Cohen and Martin Buber, exert a decisive grip on a large segment of European thought. So Buber, who's pictured here, is known for a lot of different ideas, but most significantly is his I-thou relation, which bears this existential character, and it's found throughout theological discussions and philosophical discussions. You will scarcely find anyone who's not using this phrase in a positive sense. It's very difficult to find figures that don't understand the implications of what the I-thou relation implies, which is a kind of relation, a suspension, in a suspended relation that itself foments a kind of unity that bears into it a open-ended dialogue and dialectic. It's also part of an allure of this new kind of perennialism and offering a systematic potential that draws in a great number of admirers. This ascendancy of Jewish messianism as a prime intellectual movement is highly conspicuous, and it's alongside other highly conspicuous changes in the status of Jews internationally. Both culturally and politically, we know about the Mandate of Palestine, the World Zionist Congress, the Chabad family zenith, the cultural influence of figures like Richard Stein, Karl Popper, Albert Einstein. The noticeable motions, however, are not just for the sake of eschatological interest. It's really in that the old order of the diaspora, the old order of Christendom, is finally being put away. The so-called wandering Jew, the exile, would never seem to end. This is no longer a case, and even insofar as that has come to an end, their influence internationally has grown tremendously and is being received positively. And this, I think, really shows that there is a movement, there is a zeitgeist, to use the German phrase, that in philosophy, theology, politics, finance, history, and culture, there is an understanding that the ground is receding out from under our feet, that there is no ground in first principles. We tried to replace them with the Enlightenment and it didn't work. And there's nothing to support Christendom itself. Where are we going to find the firm ground that we need? This is something that can be tied back to an analogy or an anecdote that was referenced in another one of the videos on this channel, which is regarding Laplace. Laplace has Napoleon in his presence, and he's showing him using Newtonian physics a model of the cosmos. And Napoleon is observing it and remarks, "But where is God in this?" And Laplace famously tells him, "We have no need of this hypothesis." What had happened in turn was that the early 20th century, its scientists, its philosophers, everybody, it had turned back to Laplace, to Newton, and said, "We have no need of you in our hypothesis. We have no need of you in our system, because you were wrong." and now they're looking somewhere else for their first principles, for their firm foundation. And what Erich Przywara says in his system, you could say, if he has a system, is that there is no firm ground to be had. We as creatures do not have a firm ground to stand on. We are suspended over the abyss. Our only firm ground that we could hope for is God. And even so, it is, strictly speaking, only in God, in theology. What our philosophy is always ordered towards God. And as we'll see, this is characterized by the analogy of being. So a brief overview again of Przywara's life up until the publication of Analogia Entis in 1932. He is mainly active in Munich. He's a Jesuit priest, so he has responsibilities outside of publishing for the Jesuit journal. And much of this is his extremely heavy self-imposed workload. There's laws, of course, regarding the Jesuit order. It's suppressed. They're not attached to seminaries where they teach courses. He meets most of the figures that we associate with him, Rahner, von Balthasar, Joseph Piper included, through this Jesuit publication, which is the largest in Europe at the time for Jesuits. He's also constantly reading his contemporaries, and he actually begins correspondence as his role in publishing articles, reviews of major philosophers and engaging with them himself. And he's not just reading philosophical contemporaries, he's studying church texts, historical traditions alongside Catholicism, and he of course loved St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine of Hippo. He was an avid reader of Cardinal Newman, and of course offering lecture series on sacred scriptures, which he devoted a great amount of his life to. And as a Jesuit, of course, he wrote extensive glosses and commentaries on St. Ignatius of Loyola, spiritual exercises. You really can't separate his spiritual life from his intellectual life. I alluded to his correspondence earlier with figures like Karl Barth. He actually was a correspondent with Martin Buber, Edmund Husserl, and Edith Stein, as I mentioned earlier. His reputation at the time in Europe was rather notable. He wasn't a small figure, even though he was. He's not really recognized today. Really, the reason that we might not be able to recognize him so much today is because he's always attached to somebody. There's always a fight for his legacy. But direct commentaries on his work during his lifetime were actually quite frequent. He wasn't simply attached to Rahner and von Balthasar at the time. He was recognized as being influential in his day, and people would often look to him for commentaries on either well-known thinkers or sometimes notorious thinkers, Marischal being one of them, Teilhard de Chardin being another that was controversial in his day. He was no small figure in, as we said, the German arena. He had public oppositions to Heidegger at a conference, and he had interactions with other German intellectuals, and none of those people who, again, criticized him spoke very ill of him. He had a sort of hard to get along with personality, and he had reservations on some sides. His principal work has been criticized as being very dense. His former student Joseph Piper once called it unreadable, which, as we might be able to empathize with, it is very difficult to read. But even so, Barth, again, called his work the Analogia Entis, the invention of the Antichrist, and noted he was very overwhelmed in meeting him because of the depths of his knowledge and his perceptiveness. He said he couldn't determine if he was an angel of Antichrist or a chosen instrument of the Lord, a grand inquisitor, or apostle to the Gentiles. Those being his words. Now, the criticism being few and far between, it doesn't mean that there was nothing to critique in him or that he never did anything wrong. But the point is, he was lauded in his day for his precision. And this is all to lead into our ultimate discussion of his work and why we're looking at it at all. Because truly, he's not limited to just the Analogia Entis. It's really the applications for this idea and the ideas that come along with it that make it so important. When he calls it the fundamental Catholic form, it's not simply because he's retrofitting the whole Catholic tradition to work with the Analogia Entis. It's because the Analogia Entis is itself within a frame that it has implications for critical elements in philosophy, such as the principle of non-contradiction and various other important theological facts that we recognize. The difference between theology and philosophy, of faith and reason, of grace and nature. This will all become more evident as we go along. One place he's often cited, again, because he is in critical dialogue with modern philosophy, he feels pretty strongly about, as you'll pick up in his writing, he feels pretty strongly about engaging with modern philosophy in terms that they can understand. Part of this is an ecumenical exercise, and not in a false ecumenism that we understand today, where there's an uncritical evaluation. There's praise where there needs to be praise, where things are well described or well formulated, but there's always an understanding that the Catholic Church is the only place where these errors can be corrected. And this is one of the distinguishing marks of Catholic ideas. Why is he looking for the fundamental Catholic form? Why is Przywara so intent on recognizing how this fundamental Catholic form plays into philosophy and theology? It really is because of this fact. It's because it is the distinctive mark of the Church. Again, fundamental Catholic form. Let's look at that for a second. Fundamental because it is the baseline for engaging with Christianity at all, because of the distinction it makes between a creator and creature. Catholic because it's found in all across the Christian Church, in many different thinkers and many different times. And form because it's the guiding lodestar. It is the thing that forms our theology and our philosophy, even if it's not materially the same across the board. This distinguishing fact of Catholicism is what makes it unique and salvific. And even if he has a friendly disposition towards his opponents, he does not relent when it comes to the fact of the Church's distinctive mission and its salvific character. It's not one of the many great world religions, it's the only religion. It's the only place where the fatal errors that you could find in philosophy and theology can actually be avoided. The locus for this thought is actually in two very important councils. The Vatican Council, or First Vatican Council, it was called the Vatican Council at the time, obviously, because there's only one. The Vatican Council is one of the binding facts of the Church being a concrete entity, as ecclesiology has an important component rooted in the Vatican Council, and not simply the statement it has on the infallibility of the Pope, but also the descriptions of the Church that it has throughout. However, important for us here, and especially important for the Analogia Entis, is the Fourth Lateran Council. The Fourth Lateran was especially close because, as you can see here on the far right, this image of Abbot Joachim de Fiore is a common subject to pillory at this point in time. He's sort of a whipping boy to establish one's theology or philosophy, and he can be he's even at sometimes praised in the Nouvelle Theologie, and even by some later, more recent popes have said things that are praised him more highly than he has been esteemed throughout history. He's actually condemned at the Fourth Lateran Council, and it specifically identifies his Trinitarian doctrine as being problematic. Joachim de Fiore was writing against Peter Lombard, famous for Lombard's sentences, which was a standard in scholastic reading. Joachim wrote a treatise against Lombard's ideas about the Trinity and its consubstantiality between the three persons. And Joachim associates the Trinity more with something like a community of persons, or three persons that are engaged in some kind of dramatic dialogue or open-ended relationship. And this is what's specifically condemned, because the understanding that Joachim takes is far too, you could say, creaturely. And this is where the Fourth Lateran Council gives us an axiom that Przywara uses frequently. Now, the reason that this Trinitarian idea is criticized is because it's saying the unity we have with Christ by grace is the same as the unity Christ has with the Father by nature. And this occasions the Fourth Lateran to say that one cannot note any similarity between creator and creature, however great, without being compelled to observe an ever greater dissimilarity between them. Przywara here supplies the ever and the ever greater, owing to his Jesuit motto, God ever greater. Nonetheless, this quote at the beginning shows, and as this axiom evinces, Przywara finds the distinctive mark of Catholicism is this axiom. And to demonstrate that, we can take a look at a quote also about the Fourth Lateran Council from St. Thomas Aquinas. What the Fourth Lateran Council taught is what St. Thomas Aquinas taught, and rather than just discussing Przywara's assertion about Aquinas, as we saw in the beginning, we can read for ourselves. Now, although creatures bear some resemblance to God in themselves, so great is the dissimilarity between the two, that only because of great stupidity could it happen that a mind would be deceived by such similarity. As Dionysius says, God can in no way be said to be similar to creatures, but creatures can be said to be similar to him in some sense. If the imitation is imperfect, then it is said to be both like and unlike that which it imitates. Like insofar as it resembles it, unlike insofar as it falls short of a perfect representation. It is for this reason that Holy Scripture denies that creatures are similar to God in every respect. So Thomas Aquinas doesn't think too highly about Joachim. This quote here that he pulls from Dionysius, this is Dionysius the Areopagite. He's an enigmatic theologian who is from the perhaps the 6th century, although Dionysius himself is referenced in the book of Acts and is sometimes considered a first century theologian. What's important here is not the exact place that he fits into the Christian tradition, but rather that he's treated authoritatively, because he is such a profound theologian and perhaps even philosopher, to recognize him in that way. He writes he only has a very brief and a very short corpus, but everyone, including St. Thomas Aquinas and his mentor, St. Albert the Great, they both take great inspiration from this figure. And one of the key ideas is this ever greater dissimilarity, this God who is beyond category, beyond genus, beyond existence, beyond goodness, beyond being. This is a God described as unthinkable, indefinite, superessential, radically dissimilar, not contained within any category, not contained within any system. This is the infinite God. This alone is the infinite God. So if you take a look again at this axiom from Fourth Lateran, this is the way that it's being emphasized and received by the tradition. This is the way that Aquinas is reading this. One cannot note any similarity between creator and creature, however great, without being compelled to observe an ever greater dissimilarity between them. So as we come to understand the core ideas in Erich Przywara, I think it would be very helpful actually to take a look at the argument that he's presenting. Not in its entirety, mind you. It's worth looking at the book and the argument it presents from a scope that we can understand without delving into the work itself. So its main concern, again, I'm going to repeat this because it's really worth committing to memory, and I want to keep it up on the screen. Between the creator and the creature, no similarity can be noted, however great, without compelling one to observe the ever greater dissimilarity between them. This concept is leveraged into the Analogia Entis, into arguing for the Analogia Entis, for the analogy of being. And it is the occasion for introducing one of Przywara's many neologisms, and perhaps the most important one to commit to memory, the unity intention. We'll see that this is not the same as dialectic, contradiction, or opposition, which will become more clear as we discuss it. Unity intention is better described as an ordered, rhythmic polarity, a relation, usually a one-way relation, that is between two positive polars, opposites. Now, these terms, polarity, rhythm, unity, intention, these all function in the formulation of the analogy of being. Przywara isn't looking to systematize, and he's not trying to take credit for the Analogia Entis. Again, he views this as already present within Catholicism. It's rooted in St. Augustine. We find it in St. Thomas Aquinas, and in Dionysius the Areopagite, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, however you want to say. It's present throughout the Catholic and the Christian tradition. It's fundamental. All dogma requires it. It's Catholic. It's universal among the fathers. It's a form because it is the guiding principle which secures the integrity of Catholic doctrines to core. So Przywara, drawing heavily on Augustine and Aquinas and Dionysius, takes the analogy of being into his main work, which I mentioned before is a very infamously difficult work. Will mentioned it being a very challenging work to approach, and there's no reviews of this book by the most philosophically adept and those even most accustomed to philosophical tedium. Everyone who reads this book will tell you this is one of the densest works ever written. The translator for the Erdmann's edition, John Betts, has an over 100-page translator's introduction. And the main reason for this is because Przywara is deeply engaged in his contemporaries in Germany at a level that is very precise, thorough, and relevant. He's using terms that they understand. He's using Heidegger's word Dasein to compare his ideas to Heidegger. He's using several terms that are used by Husserl specifically. He's using terms that are used by Schelling specifically, Hegel specifically, in order to engage with them critically. Now, because of this, and Przywara himself has a very peculiar style. It's extremely German. He has very long sentences. It's very poetic and written in a sort of melodic prose. He has these very complicated neologisms like unity and tension, and again, borrowing terms that are unfamiliar if you're not initiated into Heidegger or Husserl or Schelling or any of these figures. We don't need to read the entire book, simply to go through the argument. If it's of any interest to you, there is a summary of the argument in the Erdmann's edition from Dr. Betts. It's pages 61 through 73. He does an excellent job of summarizing the argument itself. What I want to do here is really merely review a part of Przywara's argument, condense it as best as I can, and establish what he means by the Analogia Entis so we can relate it back to his criticisms that we heard at the beginning. So we'll first examine the initial warrant of the argument, which is that the Analogia Entis is contained within the problem of metaphysics. There's no way to evade it. As soon as you begin thinking about metaphysics, before you start doing metaphysics, before you have a method for metaphysics, before you make a decision about metaphysics, you are already going to encounter the unity and tension characteristic of polarities. From there, Przywara interweaves the Analogia Entis with the principle of non-contradiction and shows how these two are simply, to use a phrase, two sides of the same coin. The principle of non-contradiction entails, and as a matter of fact, it's only supported by the analogy of being. And for that, I'm going to cite from the Betts summary. It's very good in relating these two ideas to each other. We'll get to that after we look at the problem of metaphysics. And then lastly, we'll look at how the Analogia Entis can only truly exist within Catholicism, what conditions apply to understanding polarities as they're understood in the unity and tension. And then we'll see the kinds of deviations that might happen with misunderstanding of the Analogia Entis, how it distorts reality, and really start to unpack what this criticism of Przywara for von Balthasar really means. And we'll understand how this is a very insightful description of von Balthasar's theology and his philosophy. And his entire project can be reduced down to those ideas of him being Dionysian and mythical. So this phrase, the problem of metaphysics, isn't my choice of words, but the way that Przywara presents the subject of metaphysics itself is principally as a problem. Now, metaphysics is the study of what is behind or after physics. It's a term that's used with Aristotle. And really what we're looking at was trying to understand reality as reality, not reality as it exists in certain disciplines, such as physics itself, where reality is understood in a material sense, cause and effect, but reality that is beyond and behind physics, what makes physics possible in the first place. So the way that Przywara introduces metaphysics is in the question of where do we start? How do we actually do metaphysics? And what we're looking at now, this is a model that I created to help our understanding of what he's setting up. This isn't a picture that he drew. this is something to help us understand what he's getting at. We're going to look at the problem of what he calls the problem of the act and the object. So before we even start the problem of metaphysics, before we start trying to look at what reality actually is and how it functions, we immediately come to this problem of whether to start with the act or with the object. Now, we are on the left here, observing reality, and we observe things on the right here. These are the things that are outside of us. Now, we want to look at reality beyond the things that are in these objects. These objects are multiple. We want to look at reality as it is a unified whole. We want to look beyond just the objects that are immediately to our sense perception. We don't want to look at this particular object. We want to look at not even all objects, but what's behind the objects, what makes objects possible. That's our main problem in metaphysics. But the dilemma here is we're on the left, and what we want to look at is on the right. We are related to the objects in the act of thinking about them. We are looking to know things about reality, but we are unable to actually jump into the object. We're sort of stuck on the left-hand side when we want to be on the right. And this is really the basis for the problem of knowledge and really metaphysics as a whole. So again, left, we have reality as it comes to us, as we can perceive reality. On the right, we have individual beings. Beings are not the same thing as being which permeates everything, the common being behind every single reality. We want to go beyond it, behind it, and looking at what makes it possible. But this distinction between things as we perceive and things as they are is a dynamic that we only understand in this particular relation, this little white arrow here. The objects that we're perceiving exist outside of this problem, so to speak. We are looking at objects that exist without our thinking about them. But the act itself relates only to objects. So this arrow is really saying that the act of thinking is related to the objects that we're thinking about. The objects don't cease to exist once we stop thinking about them, but if there was no object, then the act wouldn't be possible. So this arrow is just simply a demonstration of the way that we can say the act of knowledge is in some sense ordered towards the object of knowledge to understand the object of knowledge, while the object isn't necessarily affected, although it's contained by this act of knowledge. So another way of viewing this problem is in the terms that Przywara himself uses to establish this point between act and object. The term that he uses for the act of knowledge is the noetic, or the mental. The noetic is a term that's popularized by End and Husserl in describing phenomenology, and this is one of the main objects of phenomenology, is to comprehend the act itself and what's going on in the act of knowledge. And on the ontic side, or rather on the side of the object, we have the ontic, or the extramental. The ontic being a term that is coined by Heidegger, referring to the problem of metaphysics in a multiplicity of beings. Now, the problem that's set forth here by Przywara is metaphysics as a problem of the meta-noetic or the meta-ontic. Those are complex, again, neologisms that Przywara is very fond of, but it helps us to grasp this fundamental basis first. What he's saying is, before we can even proceed to metaphysics, we want to understand reality as it is in reality. We are immediately confronted with this dilemma between where do we start? Do we first start with the noetic aspects, where we actually are, our process of understanding, or the things we're trying to understand in the first place to move beyond them on the side of the ontic? The problem will paralyze us if we're trying to evaluate simply where to begin, which one do we need to thoroughly understand first. And really, we're going to be paralyzed if we think that either one of these is going to encompass metaphysics. Clearly, going from the ontic object to the ontological object makes sense. Ontological being within metaphysics. We're not going to be able to get there without doing so through the act of knowledge. So the act, or the noetic, on the left, and the object and the ontic on the right. We can't simply bracket out the act because it's always ordered towards an object. We can't simply jump into the object because it's always going to be through the act. Really, the act of knowledge cannot be studied without looking at the way that it's ordered towards objects, and the object cannot be understood at all without assuming something about the act, that it's trustworthy and that the act isn't distorting the object. These are best understood in the terms that Husserl and Heidegger use to describe both, relatively speaking, both sides of the problem that they're forced to take. Husserl is asking who observes the observer, in so many words, who is actually doing the observing. And we know this is real to some extent. Obviously, with the setting that we had described up to this point, there is something to be said about observation in the way that it affects reality, and it affects the object. That's clear with the double slit experiment. The object, however, is, strictly speaking, what is most real. It's what the mental act is ordered towards. So we're not going to be able to do anything that remotely resembles metaphysics before we can at least situate this problem. Now, if you've done any reading on the scholastics, or at least regarding Aristotle, you'll know that these are two inversely related sides, because what we're talking about here is the ordo cognoscendi and the ordo ascendi. This is simply another way of viewing the problem that is set up in the 20th century and that Przywara is identifying. So the order by way of cognition, cognoscendi, the order by way of essence or being, the ordo ascendi. You know that based on these terms, this is not a new dilemma. It's a dilemma that precedes modernity. It's been discussed for millennia. All that Przywara has done for us up to this point is he's laid out a way that makes it more intelligible to us, where however many millennia after this problem is first being discussed. So the idea of an object of knowledge, the act of knowledge, these being separate, and that one being related to the other, these are not inventions that Przywara has concocted himself. This is not a concoction of modern philosophy. This is a problem that permeates metaphysics from the very beginning. If you'd like more details on this examination and the way that this relates to what Przywara, in borrowing some terms from modern philosophy, called a priori and a posteriori metaphysics, you can read John Bett's summary on this, or read Przywara for yourself. Ultimately, this interrelationship between the act and the object is the way that he introduces us to the unity intention. Now, what does he mean by this? So the object is known in the act. The act is always oriented towards an object. All knowledge is characterized by this polarity. There is always the act of knowledge and the object of knowledge in what we call knowledge. There's no act without the object. And when there's an object, it's an object strictly because there is an act. So the one is characterized by these two opposite poles, which remain distinct, but nevertheless united. Even so, each one is in the other. The object is only known through the act and is in the act. And the act is always directed towards the object and has an object. So it's important to note here, as I said I was going to discuss, this polarity, this unity intention, this is not the same as dialectic. Dialectic has its own place, but this is characterized by two positives. Dialectic is characterized more by positive and negative, or rather position and negation. So being and its negation, which would be not being or nothing, are opposed to each other, strictly speaking. And only in some cases can you relate being and non-being to each other in some sense of analogy. What we're looking at here is that there's two positive affirmations being made. So you would not be able to have being and non-being in this kind of relationship to each other, because they're not necessarily ordered towards each other. As soon as you relate non-being to being, it's not necessarily non-being. It's only by a certain way of framing the problem that it becomes something else. So for instance, substance and accident. Accident's not having any being outside of what it receives from substance. The polarities that we're looking at here necessitate a relation between the two. And this relation is not a separate third thing. It's just strictly describing the way that the two polarities are structured. The unity intention will always have these two positions on either sides, and will always have positive content that is not strictly the negation of the other. So to put it another way, we said what it's not, what would another polarity look like? You have, as a really great example, you have the polarities concretely in gender. Female is not opposed to male as a negation of male. Male and not male is not the same as male and female. You can identify female by saying something is not male, but that doesn't necessarily equate. It's not the same thing as saying that something is female. What in gender construction, in language, and then of course in biological sex, these are two very distinct things that are not simply negations of the other. At the very basic level, male and female, they complement each other, and that's what we're getting at in these polarities. There's a complementarity between one side and the other. It's not an opposition, it's not a contradiction. It's that these two things are united, but they are different, and that is the problem that we're analyzing here. There's many other polarities that we can think about. For instance, the beginning and the end. The beginning is only understood in relation to the end, and the end is only the end because there is a beginning. So we can see beginnings and endings, they're not mere negations of each other. They're not one positive, one negative, but that they both have positive content in what they're describing. If you, up to this point, think that this is maybe some kind of modern sophistry, or this is too phenomenological, you could say, Przywara isn't inventing this or borrowing this from 20th century philosophers. This structuring of polarities is actually what he's identifying in the Analogy of Being. And we can see this very idea in St. Thomas Aquinas as well, in his very early work on Being and Essence, De Ente et Essentia. The essence existence distinction in St. Thomas Aquinas' work on Being and Essence recognizes the unity intention as a kind of polarity. All creatures are composed of existence and essence. On the one side, you have essence, which is found in all creatures. It makes them what they are. So in us, this is humanity, or our humanity. On the other side, you have existence and the act of being, which is what makes you real or actual. So essence, what you are; existence, who you are. We have here a reciprocal relation between these two things. This is not the one-way act-to-object understanding. This is something that is mutual, and that these form a composite in whatever they're creating. So there's a composition between essence and existence in all things that are creatures. This interdependence in unity, it still remains distinct. It's not being confused or blended together. All that's being expressed in this reciprocal relation is that the back and forth rhythm that is concomitant to a unity intention is mutual, and there's always a sense of whenever you bring up one, you're bringing up the other. This would be more fitting for what we described a couple moments earlier, beginnings and endings, or male and female, form this kind of composition, or this particular type of unity intention. This real relation that exists between both of them is something that Aquinas argues early on, and it remains throughout his thought as he proceeds through the years, including and especially in De Veritate. So composition for Aquinas, and really throughout Catholic philosophy as a whole, and now in Przywara, is descriptive of two principles in a third. So a polarity with two principles, two positive principles in a third thing. All created things are composition of essence and existence. They have existence through the essence, and they have an essence because they exist. The essence is accessed abstractly. That means you're able to grasp the essence through your intellect, while existence is accessed concretely, that is, among things that are real, and usually by the senses. Essences are only ever real when they are in existing things, but existence is only intelligible through the essence. This polarity is, again, a fact of creatures. There's positive content on both sides. This polarity is not a position and negation. It's not a contradiction between the two things. It's two different things that are forming a composite. They have a real relation between each other, and that they can be understood one to the other. These polarities have in the very concept of a unity intention, actually derive from a very primal polarity, the first and highest polarity. And this brings us to the analogy of being itself. The Analogia Entis between God, the creator, and the creation he brings out of nothing, which is ordered to its creator. So again, the uncreated God in the created cosmos. Now, bear in mind, before we go any further, the features and details of these distinct polarities, what we've gone through, this is our third one now, the features and capacities in each one don't carry over from one to the other in a perfect way. So essences are not strictly noetic, although we access them mentally. Here, the creator is not contained within the mind. He's not simply a being of the mind, but he can be known intellectually. These divisions are really alignments that help us in each instance in each of these polarities to form analogies between one and the other. And they are formally similar, but they're not materially similar each time. These are all analogies of proportion, emphasizing the dissimilarity between two things and not necessarily implying that one comes from the other. In this case, obviously, there is one coming from the other, creation from creator, but it's not the same in every single instance. Okay. Because the analogy of being is the foremost polarity, the polarity of creation itself to its creator, we will find that these polarities correspond well between God and his works. And that's really what this question is. How does the creator relate to the work that he makes? How is the working related to the work? So, because God is uncreated and creation is created, there's going to be this opposition between them that is understood as the one working and the one work. The creator is known by his creation, that is, that he is represented in his creation somehow, because there's a likeness between what is caused and then where it originates from. But the creation is only ever defined by its creator. That is, creation can only be, it's only made intelligible, it's only given meaning, it's only given existence because it's coming from the creator in the first place. The things, as St. Paul would say in Romans 4, that exist are called from non-being into being. They gradually approach God according to their natures. Their existence is suspended over this abyss of non-being from which they come out of and enter into a more mature and more real and a more complete and perfected version of what they are by their essence. Of course, this drawing out, what we mean by that is creation out of non-being, ex nihilo. This kind of creation is one-sided because God has no real relation to the things that he makes, while creation is only ever relative to the creator. It's not real. Creation is not real without this relation that it has to God. So if you think about what we've seen thus far, you'd be able to apply the divine attributes to God, such as being itself, goodness itself. So if God is the font of all this being and goodness, any beings or goods we encounter in creation only have being and goodness insofar as it pre-exists in God. In a comparable way, the things that are, for instance, red are red because of redness. Heavy things are heavy because of heaviness. Fundamental facts about reality, such as being, truth, goodness, they derive from being, truth, and goodness simpliciter. So as they exist in the first truth, the first good, the first being. So if you're paying attention so far, you might notice many of these attributes being described in terms of relations, being known by creation. These traits that I'm describing are all, in some sense, negations. This is something recognized in Maimonides as well as Aquinas. But there is a difference between the way that they are recognizing the way that these negations function. Polarities, again, they have a positive side on each. So something is being said distinctly in creator and something distinctly being said in creation. It's not merely that creation is a negation of creator. A creator is not a negation of the creation itself. But what it is saying is that that the creator is not exhausted by the creation. We don't have a full picture of the creator. We cannot exhaust the infinite creator by what appears in creation. And in the analogy would be that the act never exhausts the object. The act of knowledge is never a complete act of knowledge regarding an object. There's always, in some sense, more that can be learned about it. How much more so then for the infinite God who makes a finite creation? Because we're only looking through this opaque filter of creation, it dims this light, this infinite light of God, so that our finite intellect can contemplate him. We can only approach God through this apophaticism, through what is also called negative theology. This is agreed upon between Aquinas and Maimonides. This division between the transcendent God, who is at one and the same time immanent in his creation, is, in the words of the Fourth Lateran Council, always overshadowed by this ever greater dissimilarity between them. Creation is only ordered towards the creator is not ordered towards his creation. I'll have a little bit more to say about the relation between the transcendent God and God's immanence in his creation. But what we should take away from this is that we can see God is analogous to his creation, since things only have their existence and intelligibility from him. But God is never comprehended, he's not depleted, and he's not completely represented, although he's adequately represented by things that are finite. We see this in the one-sided relation from creatures to the creator, from the finite to the infinite, from the contingent to the necessary. This is what we mean, and this is what Przywara means, referring more broadly to the Reductio ad Mysterium, the Reductio in Mysterium, the reduction to mystery, the reduction in mystery. The boundary between creator and creature is this mysterious threshold encountered by a profound darkness in negative theology. To recall the earlier quote from Aquinas, as Dionysius says, God can in no way be said to be similar to creatures, but creatures can be said to be similar to him in some sense. With regard to the divine essence, we do not know what God is, but only what he is not. Nevertheless, the divine essence represents itself sufficiently. So Aquinas observed the Analogia Entis as the one-sided relation of creatures to God, as we just examined, and much like Przywara, much like Dionysius the Areopagite, much like the doctors of the church, you recognize that this relation is one way. We can depict this with one more analogy. The analogy of being can be shown in a material image, and the image that I've chosen for this is that of an orbit. If we imagine a moon orbiting a planet, the planet does not move relative to the moon. The moon, however, only has an orbit because of the planet. Now, when we depict orbits such as this, it wouldn't make sense to show the planet moving around something else. We're trying to understand the orbit of the moon. It wouldn't make sense to show the planet moving around something else. It would confuse our understanding of the orbit itself. So likewise, the static position of God is understood only through the gradual orbit of creation around his perfections. He's not merely the perfections, but he's their origin. And as the planet and the moon are on two opposite ends of this one orbit, this polarity, one as the fixed center and the moon as the motive body, we can also in a limited sense perceive that God's fixed center, as we approach him in our own motion or change, is our destination as well as our origin. Creation exists in this unity and tension with God. Again, this is not a composition, but an analogy where creation only makes sense in its simultaneous similarity and ever greater dissimilarity to God. That God is known to us by his creation, even though he himself is not contained by the creation. The complementarity of God as transcendent and God as immanent in creation is represented through this image, and as we'll see in a few examples that I've provided here, God can be transcendent and immanent according to different senses. Analogy can be expressed best in the principle of non-contradiction, and this will help us to understand how something can be true and not true, and really why those two things cannot be true in the same sense at the same time. Whenever we're saying something that sounds paradoxical, such as transcendence and immanence, we always have to take it to mean different senses. Of course, the principle of non-contradiction comes from Aristotle, and here Dr. Betts, in his summary in the opening translator's introduction to Analogia Entis, gives us some insight about how Przywara uses Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction from Metaphysics 6. As Aristotle formulates this foundational principle, just as the same attribute cannot simultaneously be affirmed and denied of the same subject, neither can one simultaneously take something to be and not to be. To pause here for a second, we should notice that these words, just as and neither, can situate the principle of non-contradiction itself as an analogy, especially in the way that it's formulated in Metaphysics 6. Continuing. The reason why this principle is fundamental to Przywara's argument for the Analogia Entis, indeed why he goes so far as to call it the foundation for the Analogia Entis, is twofold. Firstly, in this principle, as the most basic principle of thought, we can see precisely this kind of correlation of ontic and noetic forms. Thus, we have a basis in logic for the entire argument developed thus far. You can see that by the mode of analogy, we have this proportion which relates the ontic to the noetic, the object to the act. The way we know about objects is through these mental acts. And the principle of non-contradiction is simply a statement about how what is true about our mental processes is also true about things outside of our mental processes. This is the unity in tension, which itself belongs to the principle of non-contradiction. Dr. Betts continues, secondly, vis-a-vis the various philosophies of identity or pure logic and contradiction, pure dialectic, which either in Promethean fashion seek a more basic logic of identity, A equals A, or in false humility deny even the minimalist position that the principle of non-contradiction affords, it turns out that the principle of non-contradiction is preserved in analogy alone, since both analogy as the fundamental form of being and the principle of non-contradiction as the fundamental form of thought fall precisely between the extremes of contradiction and identity. It's worth remembering here, we're not saying that there's a third thing. There's not a third thing that's produced from this interrelationship. It's strictly speaking a relation of one to the other. This relation is contained within the polarity. In other words, for Przywara, analogical metaphysics is the only metaphysics that reflects and properly corresponds to the most fundamental principle of thought. Indeed, the former is the metaphysical articulation and presupposition of the latter. So Betts nicely summarizes for us here Przywara's point on the principle of non-contradiction. What the principle of non-contradiction says about truth, the Analogia Entis says about being. They are in a unity in tension themselves, analogous to one another. If you want one, you get both. If you get rid of one, you lose both, which again collapses the distinction of creator and creature, contradiction and identity, and so on. This should make sense so far, and I'd like to now take a look at what the distinctions are, what the implications are of the analogy of being with respect to the principle of non-contradiction and our own theological and philosophical grasp. So what does the Analogia Entis entail? Let's ask the question about these mechanics and even where this comes from in the first place. So here I'll go through a few aspects of the Analogia Entis to help make sense of it a bit more. A clarification on how God can be transcendent and immanent at one and the same time. Distinguishing between what Aquinas has to say about this analogy and how the pure equivocation that we find in Maimonides, for instance, can't be the case, or certainly would not support a Christian metaphysics. And also bring up citations from Aquinas to show where we might find this tradition prior to Przywara himself. So first, as might be suspected, this unity of tension is not something that is eternal. These polarities are a feature of creation. There are no real distinctions in God apart from the persons of the Trinity, and yet in creation, most everything we observe is in a real distinction. As a matter of fact, we could not even say that there's multiplicity in the Trinity simply because multiplicity requires as its principle potency, which does not exist in God himself. The simplicity of the Godhead assures us that the eternal persons cannot be described as having an ever greater dissimilarity between them. They share one simple divine substance. There are no two sides to each relation, but rather the persons themselves are the relations. And thus there cannot be any sense of polarity between them except in the loosest, most analogically qualified sense. We cannot apply the unity and tension to God for the Analogia Entis. As we observe, the Analogia Entis derives from the fact of God creating. That God creates is an act which is analogous to the Father begetting the Son or spirating the Spirit, but itself is not a fact that proceeds from God. That is not a fact that proceeds from God creating the cosmos. The reason for such polarities is that in representation of the Godhead, the infinite span between polarities is good modality for representing the infinite God, that God can be seen in the difference between beginnings and endings, east and west, manifold colors, things small and large. This owes to his infinity. And with this, we can see that the entrance of polarities, as with the essence existence polarity into creation, is a division not present in God, but points back to him as the one without such distinctions. Here we must also add the caveat Privations and negations are not beholden to these polarities. We can use analogies to express the difference between being and non-being, as we saw with the creator and creation distinction. Creation itself is brought out of non-being into being, but only by way of the relation that it has to God. Potency itself is analogous to act, but only in relation to act. Potency has no being in itself, and it is not, strictly speaking, a negation of act. There's something being said with regards to the way that it relates to act. This is different than features of dialectic where strict negations are present. Creatures are composed of act and potency according to their essence. Unity and tension goes beyond this relationship of simply being and non-being. And this is a claim we actually find in St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa. He says, every composite is posterior to its component parts, is dependent on them, but God is the first being. And it is not possible for God to enter into the composition of anything, either as a formal or a material principle. So what Aquinas is arguing here is that, and this is not something that he's inventing, this is not something that he's concocted out of thin air, this isn't something he read in an offhand statement by Dionysius and then takes to some far-reaching philosophical conclusion. This is really a basic idea found in Christian monotheism, that simply speaking, God is not composite, because composites imply that something is prior to what is produced by it, and God also cannot enter into a composition with anything, according to his Godhead, as a formal or as a material principle. So looking at another one, the place of creation alongside God's act of being leads us to recognize how God, namely, begins to create from eternity. Creation is a secondary object to God's one act of being. It's not a separate act, but it's a secondary object to God's one act of being. It can be thought of as a separate act, but only with regards to the object that corresponds to it. Okay, let's break that down. So because God is not anything but his own act of being, the eternal Godhead, he has no object in his act of being and no goods he pursues other than himself. So the distinction between act and object is a polarity which arises only with creation. We can imagine the creator's act of being as having an addition which is simultaneously oriented back to himself. The primary object, one could say, is God existing for himself and in himself. The secondary object, creation, exists from God and for God and in God himself. So looking with the distinctions we made earlier between act and object, that polarity, that again arises with creation. And in this model, what I'm hoping to demonstrate is that such a distinction does not exist within the creator, but comes about with the creation, the addition of the secondary object to God's single act of being. We can recognize, therefore, that God, because he is foremost in this single divine act, can will eternally, and he can know eternally, and be necessary in eternity without making anything in creation eternal or necessary alongside him. A good analogy for this is to imagine you're going on a walk. You don't have a destination in mind, but you're simply enjoying walking for its own sake. While you're on the walk, you're enjoying yourself so much you start to whistle. The whistling is a secondary object to your walk. It's part of the activity, walking, but it's not component to it. You can stop at any time you'd like without interrupting your walk. Your walk is not dependent on the whistling, but simply by the excess of your enjoyment of your walk, you start to whistle to accompany it. Note then, with God's act of being, it's not bound up with creation. It's not dependent on the secondary object. While it is, by manner of speaking, in him as an object to his primary act of being, God is not injured or dependent on the creation. He is the primary cause to everything in creation, which itself is the secondary object and secondary cause, the primary and secondary causality that we hear quite a bit in discussions of will and necessity takes place here in this division. The name he who is the most appropriate name of God, since all other names fail to signify the divine substance perfectly. This is the name, in the words of Aquinas, that signifies existence indeterminately. That is, indefinitely and without any boundaries on its infinity. St. John of Damascus also wrote that God is a boundless ocean of substance, Dionysius the Areopagite, that God precontains simply and limitlessly all existent things in himself, and thus praised and named by the diverse things that we find in creation. all forms are perfections and found pre-existent in God. As Aquinas writes, it should be understood, therefore, that since every agent acts to the extent that it is in act, that which is affected by the agent must in some way exist in the agent. This is the reason why every agent causes something similar to itself. So Aquinas speaks well to this. Because every agent is causing something similar to itself, there is a similarity, although it doesn't exhaust the cause by being its effect. The likeness to God is determined by the origination and the destination of creation, God himself in his pure act of being. Now, lastly, we have the most puzzling aspect of this Analogia Entis. I've mentioned this a few times, and I'd like to really dwell on it here. God is both transcendent and immanent in creation. You can see how some of the tools, perhaps, I've given so far, and what Przywara is using in his argument, how this can help us understand this in two different senses. This is really the dividing line. This is really where all the problems will be brought forth between Catholicism and other religions. Now, we've established that things only exist insofar as they derive from and are in a sense within God's act of being. That means that God is not to be found in creation by any sense of identity, but he's not absent from creation either. Creatures are always being drawn closer to him by his own act of being, remaining distinct, but becoming more themselves as they act according to their essence or according to their nature. Creatures are so suspended over the nothingness that they arose from, that as they come near to God, they are more definitely themselves, they're more real as they are perfected, the more they resemble him and act according to their nature. And the path that creatures take to God is this nature within them, which points to the transcendent God at all times. So that's why disobeying natural law, what is determined by nature, is sin, why it injures us, and why it causes us our destruction, our return to the nothingness, the return to the dust of the earth. Sin is hated by God for that reason. It's deviating from God as the end of all things, which helps creatures mature into their own nature. It's for our sake that he hates sin, because it's what destroys us, and it's our attempt to nullify the call into existence that we've been called into, to draw near to God himself. Przywara employs this common saying to summarize it. This is more common in Germany, perhaps, but become what you are. A pithy way of summarizing the fact of becoming something that you already are. You're already human, but you're always becoming human. This is a fact of creatures, not a fact of God, but a fact of creatures. We might, I guess, as Americans, you might be able to say something that your dad once probably told you, are you a man? Act like one. Something to that effect. The same logic applies. Become what you are. Our natures derive from and are even reducible to God's own perfection. And here Aquinas concurs with Przywara, saying, the one first form to which all things are reduced is the divine essence, considered in itself. Each essence represents different ways in which it can be imitated. God himself is the proper and immediate cause of each and every thing, and, as Augustine says, in some way he is more closely united to each thing than the thing is to itself. So God is nearer to us than we are to ourselves. He's foremost in being. He's the goad which pushes us towards himself. He's the tether that pulls us towards himself. The choice for us, however, is totally free, despite this. And matter of fact, because of it, this is a fact of our likeness to God. The more near God is to us, the more free our nature and the more free our choices. Free will itself is not a matter of God giving us space. It's not God removing himself to let us make our own choices, but it's a sign of his proximity to us according to our nature. Aquinas further argues, now it belongs to the divine excellence to move and incline and direct all things while not being moved, inclined, or directed by any other. Hence, the nearer a nature is to God, the less it is inclined by another, and the more it is capable of inclining itself. The likeness of our nature to the Godhead grants us this free will, for it is this that St. Thomas Aquinas draws on the earlier explanation of St. Augustine, as he cited before. God makes by addition and by his presence. He does not make by his absence or by making himself smaller. Let me repeat that. God makes by his addition and by his presence. He does not make by his absence or by making himself smaller. This is the well-known exclamation of Augustine in his Confessions, a very frequently cited prayer, and I think this very nicely summarizes all this that we've been looking at so far in the Analogia Entis. Late have I loved thee, O beauty, ever ancient, ever new, late have I loved thee. Behold, thou art within, and I abroad, and there I search for thee. And I deformed, plunging amid those fair forms which thou hadst made. Thou art with me, but I was not with thee. Things held me far from thee, though unless they were in thee, could not be at all. How much then does Augustine add to this by elsewhere writing that God makes what he makes by the presence of his majesty? While we used our likeness to God for evil, we have abused our free will to deform ourselves. God again draws us back to himself by his presence, by the Holy Spirit coming to us at our baptism, by the Holy Eucharist where we commune with our God in the flesh and blood of Jesus Christ, by God's presence and immanence in us again in the salvation that he wrought for us in Christ Jesus. So we've looked at now the positive argument that Przywara makes for the Analogia Entis. It sets up well to finally understand his criticism for Hans von Balthasar and criticisms that he shares for various other figures, including Joachim de Fiore. We'll be able to understand more about how this is the fundamental Catholic form and how it's distinct to Catholicism. The principal errors in our thinking about reality arise from not appreciating this polarity and the relation between these polarities, in elevating either the act or the object, the essence or the existence, in studying reality. Prioritizing one side of the unity and tension causes errors nullifying the difference between creator and creature. When this difference is nullified, similar errors and confusions can manifest. We lose the ever greater dissimilarity and we fall into the trap, as the Emerald Tablets would have it, the as above, so below, or even worse in the original type, what is above is affected by below, and what is below is affected by above. The heavens come from the earth comes from the heavens, instead of the proper distinction of creator and creation. This is divided between two sides of the same error, what Przywara calls in another neologism theopanism, and what Przywara calls pantheism. Now, theopanism he coins here to describe the inverse of pantheism, and pantheism is a term that, of course, already exists, but that he has a unique definition for. Let's break it down first by looking at the construction of these phrases. How are they inverse of each other? Well, pantheism is looking at everything as God is all. Theopanism asserting that God is all, or that God is creation, or that he becomes creation. Pantheism asserts the inverse, that all is God, that creation is God, or that creation becomes God. See the difference? Theopanism on this side of the polarity, and thus prioritizes essence over existence. Pantheism, conversely, existence over essence. This is the format Przywara uses to describe what he calls philosophies of essence, or essentialism, and philosophies of existence, existentialism. The problem then becomes where theopanism proceeds from God to creation, as if creation is a strict and necessary consequence of who God is and what God is. There's a vision of creation already being in God before there's a creation to be had. This is this is again the opposite of pantheism, where pantheism is trying to approach God in a univocal route through creation, finding his identity in creation itself. The consequence of theopanism and pantheism is always this category error, which is trying to equate creation with the process, the act of being, with God. In pantheism, when creatures tend to take on divine traits, theopanism, God takes on creaturely traits. So in theopanism, God tends to act more like a creature. He has emotions, passions. He's discovering himself, while in pantheism, creatures take on an exalted status. They're eternal. They are guided by an inherent goodness. And this is, of course, resembles the confusion between nature and grace that we can find in many, many different philosophies on both sides of this equation. The way that these can be also identified is in a way that Przywara criticizes theopanism and pantheism respectively, as they appear in very early philosophers. What he says of theopanism is that it is effectively a progress ad infinitum. This idea is that there's no set natures, and simply there's an ascent towards God's infinity, or even with God towards infinity, with no sense of what they are. The opposite is true for pantheism, which Przywara identifies as closed finitude. This is the whole cosmos is restrained, it's constricted within a certain sphere of motion, and things are so factual, so self-identified, that they are never anything but what they are right now, in fact. This quote from Przywara helps us understand a little bit more. He writes, borrowing from our earlier terminology, we can say that the differences between God and creature are annulled by way of either theopanism or pantheism. Theopanism means that, proceeding fundamentally from above to below, God becomes the all. This is the form of devolution that ultimately is immanently implicit in a purely a priori metaphysics. Pantheism then means that proceeding fundamentally from below to above, the all becomes God. Hence, this is the form of evolution that ultimately is immanently implicit in a purely a posteriori metaphysics. The unity in tension requires both and not an either or of essence existence or a priori or a posteriori metaphysics. Only the Analogia Entis preserved in Catholicism alone can ensure a coherent metaphysics and the distinction of creator and creature. And maybe to help a little bit more in understanding the differences here, because it in all likelihood is still very murky, and we need something tangible to compare and contrast these two. Let's take a look at how the Analogia Entis is lost between these two modalities, theopanism and pantheism, in their own unique ways. Theopanism begins with theology, which expands into a philosophy, treating philosophy not as a handmaiden to theology, but as a component, and even in some sense, the final end of theology. Pantheism is the opposite. It sees philosophy as capable of itself of accessing theology without God condescending, or that theology merely is the pinnacle of philosophy. Note that in either case, a person can simply be mistaken to do one while doing the other. They might think they're doing theology while they're really doing philosophy. Someone might think they're doing philosophy while they're actually doing theology. I'm sure you've met someone who says that they aren't speaking religiously, but they are speaking in mystical terms about something they hold in high regard. And the inverse, of course, there's a lot of Protestants out there who would claim that they reject all philosophy, and yet the theology is rife with philosophical claims about reality, creation, language, etc. Theopanism, with its origins on the opposite side of creation, bases its methodology in dialectic and contraries. It treats all subjects and all the lines of contradiction between God and creation, as well as between God and even God with himself. This is the progress ad infinitum desired. It's going from opposition to opposition. Pantheism inverses this, and it seeks for itself a pure identity in creation. It wants to leverage logic over everything and anything. Everything belongs to a single oneness and a concrete identity in itself. See there the closed finitude I mentioned earlier. Now, although he isn't purely on the theopanist side, Platonism does fit closer to the category of theopanism. Platonism begins with intellectual forms and higher realities, rationalism, and has a top-down, above-to-below approach characteristic of theopanism. So it makes sense then that pantheism would have a more Aristotelian tendency. Again, Plato and Aristotle aren't purely one or the other, but the stress and emphases in their philosophies respectively do demonstrate that they are following these directions. Both have analogies of a kind. They have the beginnings, the burgeonings of a analogy of being, but they don't have the complete analogy. They don't have a unity in tension. They have a mythic quality, and it drags their analogies away from proper polarities. Theopanism then has what you might call more of an Eastern character, which manifests in a less grounded mystical venture. Eastern here, I'm really just referring to Asiatic, Oriental philosophies, exceptions, of course, counted with just the way that they move. Typically, philosophies or theologies that move from east to west have this character of theopanism. It rarely moves from the Occident to the Orient. And likewise, pantheism has a Western or more empiricist motive. It's rooted in not necessarily rationalism, but pure empiricism. You have the caricature of scholasticism given by its critics, the idea that everything can be measured and calculated perspective you'd associate with someone who's overconfident in modern science. Speaking of which, if you wanted to ground all of this modern philosophy, or within modern philosophy rather, Hegel's philosophy is probably the heights of theopanism. Explicitly, it starts out with a phenomenology based on a certain conception of the Trinity, which descends into a universal philosophy. Przywara many times calls Hegel the completion of Protestant theology, and he echoes Nietzsche's derision of the Tübingen school of philosophy. And then opposite Hegel, on the other side, Heidegger's philosophy exemplifies pantheism, especially in that what cannot be strictly counted and weighed, in other words, metaphysics, is avoided at all costs. It pupates into this neo-Kierkegaardian mysticism and existentialism as a process. It's the ultimate end. I think people who read Heidegger would understand that he eventually ends up as more of a mystic in his final analysis. Heidegger exemplifies, of course, atheism, a secular response to Hegel, which is thoroughly a secular shadow of its Kantian and idealist opposite. Przywara characterizes these two as, again, the heights of theopanism and the heights of pantheism. Przywara also characterizes theopanism as a consequence of an a priori metaphysics, like starting from before experience, a posteriori metaphysics as being dependent on our sensory experience. These terms go back to the noetic and ontic sides of the act and object polarity that we first looked at. Now, all that said, theopanism and pantheism have a dichotomy of not just what their content contains, but also in where their interests lie. Where do they actually want to get to? So we know to some extent where they start and what are they actually trying to achieve. The content of theopanism is primarily eschatological. It would be thought perhaps that they are looking for an explanation of origins, but really its focus is on how these origins are going to come to a final end. All of these concerns about origins are in service to its interest in the destination, is this problem going to be rectified? How is the devolution going to be accounted for? It might have an origin story. Hegel certainly has an origin story in his philosophy, but it'll always be clearly a pattern or an inverse of the eschatology. This is famously why Plato doesn't have a real account of creation. In Timaeus, the demiurge story doesn't really explain how the demiurge comes from the first good, how motion exists in the first place, but he does quite well develop an eschatology of the final goal for all motion. Now, pantheism does the opposite. It doesn't often regard destinations except insofar as they are the capstone of the cosmogony that it develops, cosmogony being a study of origins. Aristotle is one of the best accounts of creation found among pagan philosophers, for example, but there's not much of what you could describe as an eschatology in Aristotle anywhere in his corpus. He has a prime mover, but there's no gripping tale of where this eternal universe is going. Now, all this being put together, this might look a little bit too nice and neat. There's two sides to everything. We can sort of categorize everything. Doesn't this seem like maybe the opposite of what Przywara is trying to do? He's trying to avoid a system. And I would agree with that. I don't think that you can systematize this perfectly out of what we've provided here. And that's because every single philosophy that you will encounter will have elements of both theopanism and pantheism. The tendencies are there, but every philosopher is approaching it from different angles. And that's why many philosophies, many theologies will have elements of both that characterize them uniquely. It's what makes them unique in the first place, is that they're different blends and different mixes. Remember what Przywara said about the unity and tension. The seed of the one is in the other. They're always referenced against one another. As such, any form of theopanism and pantheism contains elements of the other. They're always oriented towards each other. So you can't simply discard an entire school of thought simply as a vehicle to deal with it from a particular vantage point. They each have an orientation towards the other. So let's look at our modern philosophers here.
Hey, Jay, would you permit me to ask a question?
Absolutely.
Quickly? So if we took, for instance, like Enlightenment, deism of the founding fathers, how would we situate that between these two categories?
That would certainly be, that would fit well with the Enlightenment period philosophy, because in Enlightenment philosophy is definitely more rationalist, more theopanist than pantheist, because it's not strictly based on empiricism. The way that you would want to categorize Enlightenment philosophy generally is through this is through theopanism, as it takes on that more modern character of Enlightenment values, universal solidarity and fraternity. These values fit more into the idealism of theopanism, while pantheism has more of a character, more of an existential character, dramatic character, and tragic character.
Okay.
It was a good question, though. So looking to Hegel himself, Hegel is theopanist definitively, but not everything in Hegel is theopanist. One of the areas that he's most noted for, one of the ways he's actually still influential without his name being attached to it, is in Hegel's logic. And the logical side of Hegel is actually very pantheist. He's situating identity, and really he's finding a way to situate identity at the beginning and the end of his system. Identity, remember, is the beginning of Hegel's process to ultimate synthesis, in which a new identity is attained, a better identity, a more fulfilled and complete identity, a perfected identity. But he begins with this identity of pure logic. It's identity to identity, and this logic, which is characteristic of pantheism, is instrumental in establishing the dialectic that he's looking to find in theopanism. Identity seeking contradiction, seeking identity. And likewise, Heidegger is known for his thoughts on dialectic, the so-called hanging over the abyss, which is his vehicle to bring identity from dialectic and dialectic from identity. I mean, what does he contrast being with? It's contrasted to non-being. It's contrasted to death, the nothing that pours into being, and death, which is the ultimate end of all being. What is his project seeking? The final apposition between the two. Does that make sense? Most philosophies have elements of both. Ultimately, they'll arrive at the same place. Przywara shows us they both are facing the distinction between creator and creature. Now, strangely enough, because of this admixture, you can get some counterintuitive results, which I'd like to address here. Now, he's almost universally known as the philosopher of nothing ever changes, but Parmenides is actually more along the lines of theopanism, because he's a subjective philosopher. Remember, subject and object, subject being on the side of act, object being on the side of, object. Theopanism being more on the side of act, and then pantheism being on the side of object. Parmenides is a subjective philosopher. The static being is dialectically contrasted with the illusions of change. The entrance into the apparent chaos that we experience is nothing but a contrast to the immutable and unchanging reality. And he even arrives at the conclusion about the unchanging being because of dialectic. He contrasts being and non-being and shows that things cannot change from one to the other because it either already is, or it would have to come from non-being, which is impossible. Parmenides is pursuing this logic, but through dialectic. And in that measure, he doesn't just differ actually that much mechanically from Hegel. And so, same with Parmenides' counterpart, Heraclitus, which is, oddly enough, he's a pantheist. So why is this the case? Because think, his philosophy is objective. It's object-oriented. He's the philosopher of contraries and changes, the philosopher of you never step into the same river twice. But this is precisely to unite the contraries under a logos, a plan and identity that is beyond our reckoning. It takes serious scrutiny to discern the overriding character of a philosophy, and it can be, as shown here, both theopanist and pantheist in different ways. But it helps at least to have this dichotomy as your template. This can be all quite confusing, I know. I'd like to help showing how some of this can be imagined. And I'd like to actually give you a tangible image that you can associate with these, not just giving you names that you might be or might not be familiar with, but to also give you a tangible image to grasp onto when describing these. And this will also finally demonstrate what Przywara means by Dionysian, because we're going to establish these along the sides of Greek myth and the way that these are employed by Przywara. The Dionysian refers to the myth of Dionysus, who's also called Zagreus or Bacchus, and he's the emblem of pantheism. Przywara alludes to it when describing Aristotle's quasi-pantheist use of analogy here. Certainly, the Aristotelian movement of alternation in its abruptly changing rhythm of contradiction identity accentuates the in-between metaxy. The word metaxy here has a lineage which Will has discussed in a few places, but for us it importantly signifies the presence of analogy. Przywara relies here on the Koine Greek words that we'll see in just a second of between and part and whole, and we'll observe how these actually have an impact on the interpretation here. True to its Platonic ancestry, this form of the in-between is that of a rhythmic equilibrium, and as such, incompatible with the severity of contradiction, as contradiction has no between. That particular in-between, of which Plato has no notion, and which Aristotle explicitly subsumes under the universal, is rather the mutilated, which is to say the torso. It is at once part and whole, while the Platonic rhythm is identified by its oscillating in-between. The in-between manifested by the Aristotelian rhythm is the mutilation of the torso. That is, the remainder of that is ever again left behind by the abrupt movement of alternation. So the Koine Greek words that I alluded to is Catholicity and the universal, mutilation or the catabolic. Both of those have very similar, those have similar roots and similar origins and framings, as well as torsion or torso, which refers to the middle as well as ripping apart of a middle. Remember this as we look at the myth of Dionysus. So let's take this description from Przywara and see how it fits into the way that he relates it to Dionysus, the mutilation of the torso. We can put it side by side with what in the story of Dionysus, Zagreus, Bacchus is called the sparagmos, the tearing apart limb by limb. The story is extremely old. Its origins date back to the first wine-centered mystery cults, however you want to date those, thousands and thousands of years. It's alleged that Bacchus ascended Mount Olympus as a son of Zeus. He was going to take his rightful place on a throne of the 12, but Zeus' jealous wife Hera incited the Titans to dispose of Bacchus when he made the ascent. Bacchus arrives, the Titans meet him, they mock him with a crown made of twigs, and they offer him fake worship before grabbing each of his appendages and pulling them apart by force. Bacchus is said to have been drunk and in his ecstatic mutilation cried out for his father. The Titans ate his body, leaving only his heart, from which sprouted a grapevine, and the heart was transplanted into a human woman to be regenerated into a risen king. Aristotle's philosophies, therefore, compared to a story about the one being divided between the many, with forms being dispersed into a primeval reality. Dionysus' rise also fits into a universal motif found in all cultures and folktales about a once and future king, at one time feigning madness or drunkenness, a story that's found in all different kinds of religions and myths, and even in some places, such as Hamlet. It's even been compared to interpretations of the madness that David feigns before the Philistine king. This drunkenness and undergoing excruciating ordeal is a primal element of the sparagmos. Dionysus in the earliest sources is associated with both revival as well as the chthonic underworld deities, even being equated sometimes to Hades himself. Dionysus worship was many times suppressed because of this overturning or dismembering of social structures and hierarchies. There's also sexual overtones of the mutilation, which are not lost on the ancient Greeks. Some explicitly characterize this dimension in the inspiration for the Orphic mysteries, which are they give rise to a number of fertility rites and in ecstasies in the wilderness. Przywara, in referencing the Dionysian, the chthonic, and the fiery vitalism from his criticism of von Balthasar, refers to this pre-Hellenic and, in all likelihood, Asiatic figure who possesses those who consume wine. The division of the one deity in regeneration positions a kind of necessary suffering, a bitter burning of the wine which lightens the spirit, much like grapes which must be destroyed before they become the spirit-lifting wine. Dionysus must be torn asunder if he is to become the daemon of the orgiastic bacchanalia. Dionysus belonged to a very ancient cult. His worship, the origin for the genre of tragedy itself. The cult would gather together, and the way that they would initiate new members would be through the sacrifice of horned male animals such as bulls and goats, which represented strength. Tragedy actually receives its name from this central animal, the goat, in Greek chagos. The bleating of this dismembered goat was mimicked by the group of cantors, which were identifying the assailants with the victim, and this group chant became the very first choirs. Tragedy becomes a theatrical performance from these reenactments of the sporagmos, and really all tragedies are said to have this form of the sporagmos somewhere in the play, a division, a dividing, and all tragedy in its form has this element in the myth of Bacchus. Now, in contrast to Aristotle's mutilated cosmos, Przywara regards Plato in different terms, given he finds his to be a theopanist cosmos. He says, the real stress of the Platonic analogy thus falls upon that immortal struggle. And Plato says, the battle is undying. Gods and spirits are our allies. Moreover, we are the property of these gods and spirits. The creaturely moves between these two extremes, that of being enclosed within. We may not say of the universe that it perpetually turns itself, and that of being moved by God. We may not say that it's perpetually turned by God. The quote here is often paired with the image of these spirits and virtues riding upon man like a charioteer controlling horses. And some Protestants might actually recognize this as a more antiquated version of Martin Luther's parable of God and the devil riding the believer like a donkey, which Przywara elsewhere in another quote recognizes. Anyway, continuing. Alternating between being immediately led by God, who guides it on its path and imparts to it its revolving motion, and rapidly falling away when God releases it, and it then begins to turn back again on its own in the contrary direction, without, however, supposing its cause to be some twofold, that is, both good and evil, ground of the world. We must not say it is moved by two gods. Przywara stipulates this dualistic picture here doesn't terminate in a pure opposition, but rather an analogy between two figures which struggle and merge into one motion, a rhythm which becomes the identity. Not quite like Aristotle's metaxy, which is, strictly speaking, a one relation. This is a sum greater than the parts. It's not derived from it. Now, Przywara is less explicit in the mythic associations of Plato, but the immortal struggle he describes recalls the chariot of the sun, the motions accorded to the wayward arc in the heavens, and this is most often known as the myth of Phaeton. The son of Helios recklessly demands his hapless father to hand over the reins to the chariot of the sun. Phaeton embarks on his daytime ride over the earth, and at some point he loses control of the horses carrying the chariot due to his own adolescent inexperience. The chariot plummets to the earth, constellations are thrown completely out of order, the face of the planet is scorched. Zeus intervenes by throwing a lightning bolt at the chariot. It kills Phaeton, who falls into a river. Helios takes the reins of the horse's back. The body of Phaeton descends into the waters, and it raises a sickening stench from the riverbed, and he glows from his watery tomb. As should be evident, this corresponds to Plato's descriptions of the forms descending into the material world, the highest good somewhere unseen beyond, like the rays of the sun, which illuminates them all and grants them intelligibility. Now, while the myth of Dionysus has its appeal among a disaffected underclass and the malcontents of an ancient society, this myth had no real mystery cult surrounding it. Instead, it found appeal among the intellectual elites, those who sought a hidden knowledge about the origins of the world, or who sought a hidden knowledge about where the world is going. And well-educated Pythagoreans and the Pythagorean mystery cults elected this as actually one of the few myths that they retained. The Pythagoreans, who rejected many, many myths, this is one of the few that they actually retold. Even ancient Egyptian priests remarked that this story was very much like the story of Ra losing his eye and it being thrown into the Nile. There's often an element to the tale, much like Dionysus, of ecstatic and sexual gratification, which is in this image somewhat retained. Phaeton in such imagery is usually turned completely upside down, with expressions indicating such a character to his fall. So we have here a very strange story. It's a once well-arranged cosmos, for reasons beyond the reckoning of its master, has its just course derailed into a tragic fall to the earth. However, the identity and antiquity of this myth inspires more controversy than you might actually imagine, even more than Dionysus. The figures in the story, even more than Dionysus, have ambiguous identities. Helios may be an import from Canaanite worship of Baal, and it could even originate with horse tribes in the Eurasian steppe. The oldest stories about Helios do not even have him with a son, but rather the name Phaeton identifies either Helios himself with one of the Titans, Saturn. Saturn himself was emasculated and thrown from a chariot by Zeus during the Titanomachy, or the war against the Titans. and the overthrow of the Titans culminated in this final act of patricide. The damage caused by Phaeton's chariot ride seems to be more permanent than the tragedy plays imply, as the astronomers in ancient Greece point to the Milky Way as the original path of the sun before Phaeton detached it from its original course. Saturn's identification with the sun, the passage of time, and the inexplicable destruction of his offspring allude to a nexus of mythic tales that all allude to the same kind of hidden mystery regarding the universe's fallen course. We are under a solar governor shifted to the wrong track, perhaps at least being redirected to its proper place. Both of these myths have their ostensible tragic character, the very genre owing to the implacable force that only comes to our knowledge in the grip of a mystery cult. The instruction in such mysteries comes from the process you'd enter the temple in the dark, and then you were suddenly seized and then thrust into the cult initiation. These cultic rites encompass a process of reenactment, imitation, and of course, ritual sacrifice. Religions, for the most part, had this character of the tragic, with sacrifice, especially in Mediterranean rituals, having no clear single explanation. It was not, as some might imply, a very simple process of punishing something else. It wasn't strictly a ritual feast. It wasn't strictly a way to honor the hunt. There's no single explanation apart from the fact that they all retain more or less this tragic character. In a anthology volume, Ancient Mediterranean Sacrifice, you can read how academics and scholars, historians, all struggle with this question of what the point of sacrifice was. The genre, however, remains more consistent than the practice of just shedding blood, consecrating consumable goods like livestock, fruits of the harvest, to a single deity as if they're going to eat it or possess it. Before gratitude, the hallmark of what marked an act as supernaturally charged was this tragic element, the identification with the deity, the presence of the deity immanent in the sacrifice. This is expressed in the philosophies of both essence and existence. The finitude in one area proposes a necessary deficiency. Thus, in pantheism, the limits of existence are to be found in the essential finitude, where the laws of reality bear down on us all. Even the divine is under the law. In theopanism, there are no essential limits to reality, but only the fact of our existence, whether or not we ourselves get to be a part of the infinite ascent, since not all get to be a part of it. The Catholic religion, uniquely, does not center on tragedy. We foremost recognize God's creative aspect by adding to himself. He's not subtracting from himself. God doesn't take up space even in his infinity, so he doesn't need to contract himself. He doesn't need to cut himself apart in order to create. That makes creation not an inherent tragedy, but rather a joyful occasion. Additionally, from the perspective of the incarnation, all such notions of tragedy Przywara completely rejects. The sacrifice of Jesus Christ necessarily falls outside the genre of tragedy, and he explains this repeatedly. To paraphrase his unfortunately verbose way and disparate argument for this, the tragic has several elements which do not appear in the death and resurrection of the Son of God. Tragedy is usually defined by dramatic irony. Every tragedy has this. A goat doesn't know it's about to be sacrificed, and the audience is aware of the genre. The victim is entirely ignorant. If you think of any Shakespearean tragedy, people in the play, the characters do not know of what's going to happen. But the opposite happens in Christianity. Jesus predicts his death repeatedly. There's no dramatic irony to be had except on his contemporaries who did not understand his prophecy. Likewise, the cult of tragedies has in its initiation the sacrifice as part of it, the incorporation into the body of the victim through that initiation. However, in Catholicism, you're initiated first before you can participate in the sacrifice. You cannot partake of the Eucharist before you're completely initiated through water baptism and anointing with chrism. And finally, the tragic has a decisively satirical character, especially the satire of the victim, the exaggerated masks, the symbol of the satire itself being a kind of mimicry taking place, establishes this whole genre of tragedy as an extensive commentary and satire of reality. In this way, is always destructive. Christianity, however, does not begin with the imitation of the participants with the victim. It is the victim that's mimicking the participants, God becoming man in the likeness of sinful flesh, and then man only much later becoming like the God who became man. There is no satire and no exaggeration, save for what the victim says about the participants. It is the inverse of a tragedy. The satirical and commentary nature of tragedy becomes evident here. Tragedy is not simply a lament, but it's an attempt to explain, it's an attempt to solve all mystery. This can be expressed as the mystery of creation, which does not explain itself, the mystery of iniquity and suffering. Tragedy is always looking to have an answer for evil, and really to all mystery, and explain it through the language of tragedy. Theopanism and pantheism are simply two modes of trying to do away with mystery and to solve it. Przywara remarks here on theopanism. In the former case, the confusion of theology and philosophy occurs in such a way that at the beginning stands theology, and at the end a philosophy that is theology, and a theology that is philosophy. The particular historical instance of this is the theology of the Reformation. Here, Przywara lumps together Protestant theology into one category, not merely on account of Luther's theology, but because of its ecclesiology in the shadow of Deus Absconditus that lurks in every corner of Protestant soteriology. He continues, and we can take as an example of this the way in which Hegel's philosophy originates from and grows out of theology, and conversely, the way in which it leads to the transformation of theology into philosophical dialectic. But we can also see this in the contemporary unity of theological and philosophical dialectic, specifically in that one sees behind dialectical theology a universal spiritual apparetics, referring to a kind of universal skepticism. Therefore, you can see how Przywara explains the problem of theopanism. Theopanism solves the mystery of creation by depleting God and theology. It narrowly makes God into a creature of existential difference to us, what makes us, in essence, not the least similar.
Jay, can I stop you for a second?
Yes.
Can you go back to that previous slide? What you said about that idea that undergirds all of the Reformation, can you revisit that briefly?
Sure. So the idea regarding Protestant theology and what is really making it possible in the first place is this idea of an unknowable God who is so inscrutable as to his motives not being deducible to rationalism. That's something that is found in Luther's theology. That's the Deus Absconditus. At the same time, there is a threat of this God in Protestant soteriology because of the other aspect of Luther's thought, which is his desire to know that he is saved. How do you know that you are saved? And there's this tension, and it's not a unity in tension, but a strict contradiction between the fact that you can rationally know that you are saved, but you cannot rationally know anything about this God who's making these decrees and these promises to you. This is the problem that's undergirding Lutheran theology and really Protestant theology as a project, because if you go to every single Protestant, you're asking what their main ecclesiology is. It's that we can't know where the church is necessarily, or that you don't necessarily know who around you is saved or if those in the church are saved, but somehow you yourself know your faith well enough that you would know to be saved. You cannot discern in this system the purposes of God, but you can understand it well enough that he wants you saved. That's the contradiction.
Excellent. And briefly again, that last part, the dialectical theology as a universal spiritual apparetics.
Yes, by apparetics, Przywara uses this word. There's no real easy way to translate the German word from what I understand, but it's referring to a kind of skepticism. All skepticism has this dialectical notion about, and really this dualistic, passive dualistic component to it. Skepticism leads to a kind of dualism between not knowing whether something is X or Y, if those two things are in opposition, whether you will never be able to know or recognize whether something is or is not. And that kind of dualism leads to a significant number of problems for the problem of knowledge, obviously, but its own spirit in recognizing that dualism leads to a primacy of the rational over the empirical, and also a problem with recognizing opposition in the first place. The two things can actually be the principle of non-contradiction that we established is so important for the analogy of being.
And so then this last statement, theopanism solves the mystery of creation by depleting God in theology. How's it depleting?
it's trying to deplete God in theology, saying we have everything that we need to know about God in theology. Now we can solve creation. We can know everything that there is to know about creation because we're able to extract everything we need to know about God from theology. We can be done with the mystery. That's Hegel's explicit project, is sort of getting away from mystery in the first place, and then carrying that over into creation as to be able to dominate creation as its own God.
Excellent. I wanted to highlight this quote in reference to the mythic symbols that you outlined of Phaeton and the Sparagmos in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit by Hegel. He says the life of spirit is not the life that shrinks from death and keeps itself untouched by devastation, but rather the life that endures it and maintains itself in it. It wins its truth only when in utter dismemberment it finds itself. It is this power not as a positive which turns away from the negative, but as that which tarries with it, and in tarrying looks in the face and dwells with it. So that tarrying with the negative concept is posed in reference to this utter dismemberment, echoing the mutilation of the torso. But it seems like that falls on the wrong side, right? Because Hegel would fall on the side of the Phaeton, right?
Right. And exactly. And that's a good point. That demonstrates Hegel's logic, the idea that he is employing as an instrument, this idea of dismemberment, this idea of, which we'll see in a little bit, the idea of outpouring and renouncing oneself. That's more characteristic of pantheism, but he's employing it in order to get to the point of dialectic. The dismemberment takes place for the sake of the dialectic that he's trying to achieve.
Excellent. Okay, I think I'm starting to get it up. I'll let you keep going.
So when it comes to pantheism, Przywara explains, conversely, in Heidegger's pure philosophy, one sees the theological impulse of Kierkegaard at work. In the latter case, the same confusion of theology and philosophy takes place, but in such a way that a philosophy, which is conceived as absolute, stands at the beginning, one whose original impulse is either expressly mystical, as in the Platonism of the Renaissance. And stopping here for a second, Przywara here refers to existential mysticism that's latent in so-called pantheist philosophies. This is clear in Kierkegaard's idea of faith, which is found in Fear and Trembling. Faith for him amounts to a kind of like lust for life, which is as much as home with Nietzsche's call for a new Dionysus as it is in Heidegger's Dasein. Continuing. Or one that is emphatically apostate, that is religious, but with all the symbols inverted, as with all the forms of positivism, but especially those commencing in our day. Przywara shows here how pantheism solves the mystery of creation by growing into God in philosophy. The everyday life somehow touches the transcendent, and one merely finds God in the banal, or to use a $3 word, quotidian, a God limited to our own essential faculties. The transcendent appearing in the everyday, but not merely appearing, but actually present in the everyday. That God's existence is found only in this everyday. There is no transcendence to be had. Now, having seen these two outcomes, I want to highlight what has been described as a puzzling conclusion here. Still referring to pantheism, Przywara says, at the end of either, one consequently finds a theology immanent to philosophy, in other words, a mythos, be it that of a cosmic mysticism, as in Spinoza and Giordano Bruno, or of a chthonic Dionysian world, as in Nietzsche, or of number, measure, and weight, as in the various positivisms, etc. One can see here how Jewish messianism is at work in one way or another. So again, he's still referring to pantheism somewhat here, but he's saying that this aspect of Jewish messianism is at work in one way or another of both sides of pantheism. And as we'll see, he has more to say about this specific subject. This is implicit in its formal ground, in the deification of the law, and thus the dependence of God on the working of human beings, reaching its extreme in the Talmudic mysticism of the becoming of God in and through man. So this is a very interesting turn regarding his contemporaneous movements of Jewish messianism, logical positivism, and those with a bold pantheist fold and with a somewhat theopanist impulse. He's identifying a final possible error, a composite of pantheism and theopanism. We saw earlier that at times, as with Hegel, Heidegger, Parmenides and Heraclitus, there's elements of both pantheism and theopanism in the most sophisticated philosophies. So what's happening here? How is it that this idea in Jewish messianism, how is it that it's straddling both as to be at work in both, as Przywara explains here, without being the Analogia Entis? Final possible error that we're going to look at is the composite. Before we do that, I'd like to highlight John Bett's footnote on this passage. If this seems a curious conclusion to reach, and if the identification below of such messianism with a species of pantheism seems bizarre, it is necessary to keep in mind that Przywara is writing in light of the school of German Jewish idealist messianism that produced the quasi-Kantian Hermann Cohen, the quasi-Schillingian Franz Rosenzweig, and their intellectual progeny, particularly Martin Buber. This is critical to note. Cohen and Rosenzweig would both fall with certainty along more theopanist lines. They're both neo-Kantian or neo-Schelling German idealism. Martin Buber is more along pantheist lines, which Betts indicates here, and this is more explicit in who Przywara is addressing. In fact, in his 1925 article on Judaism, Przywara describes them by this very division. Cohen and Rosenzweig as well is on the side of Kant and on the theopanist side, and then Buber on the pantheist side. So Jewish messianism as a category considered altogether is operating across both lines here. Now Betts goes on. The distinction Przywara is at pains to make here and hereafter is one between a largely Barthian theology that reduces the creature to a mere manifestation of God's absolute will, and a form of modern idealism that sees God as achieving his identity in and through the creature. In either case, quite contrary to what either school supposes or intends, the real difference, the analogical interval between the divine and creaturely, is effectively negated. This difficulty, Betts explains, is that Jewish messianism in this passage refers to a pantheist tendency despite the apparent coincidence between theopanism and pantheism in the whole of Jewish messianism. So we have to ask, how does Jewish messianism appear in both pantheism and theopanism? Przywara has in many places remarked that Judaism contains within its essence the same polarity found in Catholicism, especially in conversations he's had with the Jewish philosopher and Rabbi Leo Beck. John Betts has at many times written specifically on Przywara's evaluation of Judaism, and he's defended him against charges from scholars like Paul Silas Peterson on Przywara's relationship and assessment of Jewish messianism and Judaism in general. Przywara, however, is intent on identifying a rather curious and specific tendency in some authors and traditions, with Judaism containing it most evidently. He doesn't name this error specifically, but we can think of it as something of a composition between theopanism and pantheism. The issue is that the Analogia Entis navigates between theopanism and pantheism where the polarities are understood. But its achievement dissipates, the achievement that we arrive at with the Analogia Entis, if the relation of polarities is misinterpreted. What I have here is a relation that is mutual between the creator and the creation. The creation is not only ordered towards the creator, but the creator in some way is ordered again towards the creation. If the relation between God and creatures is not simply a polarity of creatures to God, but a polarity of reciprocity, then God and creatures enter into a composition, which again, remember from Aquinas, that such a thing is not possible for the Christian or for a completely simple God. A God who is not himself composite cannot enter into composition. But in this model, both God and creatures make up one universe. And the manifestation of both pantheism and theopanism is possible in one place. You can have the polarities, but if the relation between them is not well understood or well placed, you will have both errors occurring throughout the entirety of the system, religion and philosophy. This is characteristic, as Przywara argues, of Judaism itself, since Judaism and Christianity originate with the revelation made to Israel prior to the first century. The polarity of creator and creature and all its derivative polarities cannot be ignored in the Old Testament. It's throughout the Old Testament. You will not be able to escape that fact if the Old Testament is a sacred book. It is thoroughly present in the mystery of knowing the unknowable God. The practice of Jewish magic, mysticism, theology, however, is radically different. It posits just this kind of reciprocal relationship with God. Therefore, the distinctive mark between Judaism and Catholicism is what kind of relation exists between these two ends of the polarity, between God and creature, between God and nothing. As I mentioned, there's more than one example of this kind of composite of theopanism and pantheism. I'll highlight 4 historical examples that Przywara explicitly references. Judaism bears as its inner essence the polarity between being created and creation, mystery and law. Thus, it stands on one side of religion as a revolution, an enormous change of dying and rebirth, and on the other side, it holds firmly a religion of eternal unity. There is an opposition to all religious types which exists between a pure God of distance and a pure God of nearness, between the pure passivity of mysticism and the pure activity of work. Judaism, in its final secret instincts, feels itself to be as the constantly chaos creating and out of the chaos new creating creator God in the world. Now, Przywara clearly envisions Judaism to have these polarities situated owing to the revelation, again, that is evident in the Old Testament, the Psalms themselves being this clear distinction between us as the creatures and God as the creator. But he further observes that this becomes the inversion of the Christian. To this extent, Judaism has within itself the inner essence of the tragic, and to some extent, it also has the elements of satire as well. Now, he studied Judaism throughout his life. Przywara studied Judaism throughout his life. He was engaged with discussions with, obviously, he was a correspondent of Martin Buber, Leo Beck, and towards the end of his life, he was actually very intensively studying every volume of the Talmud when he was doing his conversations with these individuals. His analysis of Jewish messianism in his 1925 work on Judaism applies here the best. He specifically looks to the Kantian theopanism of Hermann Cohen and the existential pantheism of Martin Buber. Both philosophers have their own distinct projects. Notably, Buber is a staunch advocate for Zionism, and Cohen opposes Zionism in favor of a global diaspora. The content of their thought overlaps in a couple key areas. They concur on mankind's self-destination, mankind's infinite horizon. It is a tragedy of life in God, a divine struggle within itself, a moral mystery, a practical project regarding law and mystery. Cohen exemplifies this hypernomian aspect in his view on consciousness, which itself for him is the law as God, and the eliciting of the true law into creation, the creation of the law, or rather the bringing about God into creation by eliciting out the divine law. Now, Buber himself trudges near the antinomian in dissolving the law's limits and all limits generally. As been discussed elsewhere, setting limits on the limits of the law is what fulfills the law. The idea of Ein Sof being the setting of the limits and then the overcoming of these limits by setting limits on those limits. To phrase it as clearly as you could probably elicit out of those mystical writings. The mystic dissolution between the I and the thou in Martin Buber's writings is the dissolution of the practiced law and the eternal law in creation. It's not a true dissolution, but it's the relation that takes shape more than anything else. It's that metaxy that we saw in Aristotle that is taking primacy. A Jewish messianism, which is emblematic of Judaism as a whole since the medieval era, requires 3 things according to Przywara. 1, the diversity of all peoples within the unity of humanity as its inner ideal. Baraya, or creation. That's the first thing. 2, a path to its messianic goal in renouncing the present reality to ascend into the infinite. Yetzirah, or formation. And 3, social morality as the telos of creation. Messiah, or action. Thus, the unity of the 2 modes of knowing God, the limitless Ein Sof and the living God of revelation, takes place within the privilege and grace, as well as the noble tragedy and eternal descent of Judaism. The exaltation of Judaism's tragedy is the repetition of God's own tragedy, as well as the heroic mission to cultivate the so-called germ of God, to empty the vessels of the Gentiles and instruct them in the law. The polarity of this heroism and tragedy is readily apparent in certain historical narratives, the calamity of history against Jews, as well as the deliverers who become the righteous among the nations. This, however, is only a derivative sign of the most primal and most final of these occasions, Lurianic eschatology and cosmogony. From the Zimzum comes the vessels and the Adam Kadmon, who disperses into every human soul in the calamity of the Shevrot HaKalim, the breaking of the vessels. We can recognize to some extent the parallel to the half-divine Dionysus being ripped apart, and there is some historical precedent for this, considering the theories about Dionysus and the Canaanite deity Baal being the same figure. But we don't need to speculate on this, since this myth is in Judaism already, and it's tacitly acknowledged. The coming Messiah for Jews is going to distribute his one kingdom into many. At times divided, these kingdoms are going to be united under this one Messiah, although the one Messiah is going to distribute them to different rulers, much like how Jacob distributed the different kingdoms to his son. This was actually one of the signs that Sabbatai Zvi, for instance, performed in the synagogue, was assigning the different kingdoms to different disciples. The division of the one into the many is in Judaism itself an act of the divine, an act of creation. Conversely, the world of Tikkun corresponds to the reestablishment of the divine image in creation, the setting right of this derailed course of the heavens and the perfection of what has otherwise been a slipshod adventure for creation. The Tikkun Olam has this as its limitless horizon for human progress, the project of a moral life becoming the hidden ethical chart by which the Tohu Wabohu, the formless void, is restored and reordered. What was God's tragedy becomes the human epic. The identification of this process with the fall of Phaeton, again, does not need to be done by our own speculation. Phaeton is astronomically and mythically parallel to Saturn. He's already been a symbol of Jewish messianism as well. The reign of Saturn in the heavens is alleged to precede the birth of the Messiah, another symbol of Sabbatai Zvi, from whom he takes his name, Sabbatai meaning Saturn. This was one of the signs of his messiahship for those of his contemporaries. Now, the relationship of polarity is a mutual interdependence of the Ein Sof with the living God, the creator and his burgeoning image. I have perhaps rather controversially designated as composition. Of course, this is not explicit in the literature. This is addressed in one way or another in Gershom Shalem's major trends in Jewish mysticism. But according at least to the position that we're taking with Przywara and the framework and the lens that he understands composition alongside Aquinas, this idea of composition between two principles still stands. Composition is a third thing, having two principles. And surely Ein Sof having no principles, but the fact that God is in a place, the hamakom, and that he must retract to allow creatures to exist indicates a shared third space that God occupies alongside creatures, themselves being two principles in some sense of a third. This becomes more clear once we understand that Ein Sof in its infinite nothingness is pure potency. Matter in Judaism is not like the Aristotelian concept of matter. This is something discussed as much in other literature on Jewish mysticism and on Kabbalah. And for what it's worth, this part is not itself controversial. Matter itself is the principle of actuality. Whenever you hear someone describing Judaism as having this bodily aspect, this is something that they're alluding to. Spirit has the negative aspect in the potency aspect, and while matter itself is the principle of actuality, spirit is kind of like a potent space, like a space in the lungs when you take in a breath. Hence the metaphor of Simsum being like a breath drawn in by the Ein Sof. Infinite power is infinite potency. Potency stands between two alternatives at all times, including privation. In fact, it is only when limit and definition is implemented that good can arise. In this framework, the shell precedes the fruit, evil precedes good, law precedes the tikkun. We can therefore make sense of how the difference between Maimonides and Aquinas on apophatic or negative theology takes place. Maimonides envisions the Godhead, which is utterly simple, constituted by negation. This is echoed by Shalem in Major Trends. Even Ein Sof means limitless. It's constituted by not having limits. That itself, the shell preceding the fruit, positive statements deriving from negative ones. We call God good because he is not evil. But on the contrary, Aquinas within the Catholic tradition holds the opposite. The negative statements derive only from positive statements. Even though for Aquinas, these positive statements serve to establish negative statements such as God's infinity, they do not have a foundation in a simplex of negation. Aquinas is able to argue this only because of the Analogia Entis. Maimonides does not have the Analogia Entis, but retains the polarities, indicating the dual principle cosmology supplied by a God consisting in pure negation, a creation consisting in pure affirmation. The law is seen as this pure negation itself is setting the limit, and it bodes to Przywara's assessment of Jewish messianism in God coming to know himself through the law. Przywara, of course, counters more than once that the limit defines the creature, and limit is itself the relation of creatures to God. Whenever you have limits, this itself constitutes a relation. Having examined Judaism and Jewish messianism, we can take a look now at a few other theopanism and pantheism composites to see how they compare to this one. Because of its familiarity, we can look at modernity next, as well as modern philosophy. In Plato, it is transfigured into the ideality of a struggle that bears the traits of immortality. In Aristotle, it unmasks itself as the reality of an ultimate torso, the countenance of finitude within the eternal alternation of movement. These are the two basic forms of a metaphysics of immanence: idealism's progress in infinitum and realism's closed finitude, which are first intertwined in modern philosophy. Przywara refers here to the advent of modern philosophy as the uncritical blending of Platonic and Aristotelian analogies. And this is what happens with Hermetic and small c Kabbalistic emphases of Renaissance Europe. These distinctions are really the emphasis of trying to rectify a perennial tradition or establish a perennial tradition with something that is more classical. It's this Hermetic impulse that is persisting in the classical period and then into the medieval period. And then in Renaissance, humanism is finding a way to intertwine them in a way that is receptive to Renaissance humanism. Continuing. The extent to which the Platonic progressive analogy appears as an expression of heroic idealism is a function of the Platonic having to overcome the abyssal chasm of the charismos, the Greek word for separation or division, that lies before the blessed other shore. The Aristotelian regressive analogy, on the other hand, bears the stigma of a tragic realism because it aims from the very first at the harmonious ideal of a seamlessly secure enclosure, and thus betrays itself as, at bottom, the sobriety of a shipwrecked idealism. Modernity forces us into this double-minded synthesis. A heroic idealism, much like the Tikkun Olam, and a tragic realism, much like the Shvarat HaKalim. We're all aware that what modernism entails with the specific propositions outlined by Pope St. Pius X and Pascendi is something akin to pantheism. Nevertheless, in our present cultural and social setting, we have a greater fusion into a theopanist egress as well. Modernism in most forms admits to a kind of scientistic material affect, the totalizing logical positivism, which only looks at things in terms of brute facts. It's divorced from any sense of the immaterial. It refuses to acknowledge the immaterial. However, we also recognize an opposite and quite insistent mysticism, which accompanies this through New Age spiritual practices, syncretic religion, and the associated disciplines which exploit modernism and bland empiricism develops into this ecstatic blend of esotericism, which allegedly foretells of a psychic awakening in man, the Prometheus rising. The two, in turn, they ape one another. The New Age spiritualism is looking to unlock the human potential for a self-sufficient material well-being, a pursuit that often is sought in science. While scientific obsession culminates in technocratic eschatology, it's seeking to bring forth a technological deity from the presently unutilized material universe. The two approaches represent a tangled knot of idealism and realism, which only with great difficulty can be de-interwoven, to borrow from Przywara's words. Przywara himself is not a modernist. Though he is not a figure prominently featured in the bouts between modernism and the hierarchy, usually because Germany was exempt from the clashes during the Pius pontificates. Przywara had his own bouts with modernism through his engagements with modern philosophy. He had a much different approach to combating it. He recognized there was a problem, specifically a Hegelian or Cartesian problem regarding first principles that took place around him. Modernism tends to exalt the human and the patterns of living as the ultramundane task of religion, while its dialectical opposite is the treating of religion as purely symbolic. The details have a significant variation, but the task is not to divorce the humanist ethos from the symbols of religion or to make religion simply the symbol. The sacred signs of religion are more than simply performance. This much can be gleaned from the advancement of secular sacraments, the oft-mentioned canceling and public apologies being forms of like a de-Christianized symbol of repentance that only has its barest symbolic relevance. The human is effaced in these symbols, while at the same time Christian symbols are removed and they show the whole effort to be an absurd one. And modernity overall has such a confused relation between these aspects and between matter and spirit that there's no account for how there's any interaction whatsoever. Not one acting on the other, not them acting on each other, simply no account for them having a relation at all because they can't account for one even existing. As such, much of modern man's days are to cope with these simultaneous narratives that do not cohere. Spirit is something more or less meaning hard work. Matter is so total that it doesn't have limits or defining characteristics, and it functions as a synonym for being. A good example of this confusion exists in the historicizing narratives that take place between moderns. So to give a great example between, and something that we're all going to be familiar with as moderns, evolution as a creation narrative. So evolution as a creation myth for modernity, it does more than simply replace the biblical creation account. Evolution is a process that's worked out in the daily fulfillment of our wants and that eventually transcends the immediate care for one's bodily needs and characterizes the current situation as a necessary consequence of what came before it and also what's going to come. The human life itself belongs to this natural procedure towards something even greater, something never before seen. You can think of this even in terms of like the emergence of an Übermensch through biological evolution. However, at the same time, there's this overarching narrative which is looking to restore some lost golden age in which we've abided better to our nature. The current time in this leg of the story is emerging from a dark age where human flourishing was interrupted by a disconnect between our consciousness and what we're doing according to our nature. And this is often blamed on the Catholic Church or Christianity in general. But sometimes it's even blaming post-industrial life. Civilization itself receives blame for this darkness in the human heart, that we're not listening to our nature anymore. The admixture of these two, biological evolution and historical restoration, causes a massive disconnect between the ways that we actually interact with the past. And this can be most seen in caveman anecdotes. You might be asking, caveman anecdote, what does that mean? And this is the kind of anecdote that you'll be familiar with in a casual conversation, something that is trying to explain a human behavior or some biological mechanism with an explanation that it served some function in a primitive human society. So, for instance, men in Cro-Magnon days were supposed to go out and hunt while the mate was supposed to stay behind and before some domestic activity like picking berries, rearing children, etc. Now, the conflict here becomes clear in that this anecdote I just provided can be equally applied to both the restorationist narrative and the evolutionist rhetoric. You can cast this as an underdeveloped impulse, which doesn't have any relevance for us, or you can characterize it as the ideal according to our natural design, which has been robbed from us over time. In either case, this stock character of this caveman is a feature of both types of narratives because they're both are discussing origins, and evolution tends to have this view of humanity as emerging from a natural and persistent function. From these creation myths, moderns derive a host of other cultural artifacts. One familiar to those who frequent these types of topics in this genre of content will be familiar with these in terms of categories of solidarity and categories of defilement. These are human creation narratives that allow a picture of both one human family in which there's no room for exclusion, no discrimination, or even tangible identity. Humanity is this abstract object, and differences are supposed to be overcome and diversity embraced. However, it's also true that certain actions can brand you as unfit for this society at large. This solidarity is pre-existent and is an abstract factor, while the specific activities, the concrete activities, can cause a particular and concrete person to be deemed in other words, unclean. If public perception finds you to be, for instance, racist, prejudiced, rude, you can find yourself in a state of more or less ritual defilement. It is sometimes argued, echoing Popper's open society, that these states of defilement are only things that are against this category of solidarity, as you might argue with racism or discrimination. This, however, doesn't recognize the scope of solidarity and defilement. A history of violent crime, for instance, is not sufficient grounds to rid you of your human solidarity. As a matter of fact, you'll still find plenty of sympathy if you have a history of violent crime. And it's sometimes even deliberately forgotten to avoid this cognitive dissonance. Meanwhile, the status of defilement can be incurred even if you are a victim. You can be defiled even as a victim of violent crime. This will be called trauma and has to be ritually cleansed through activities like self-care or therapy. These modern peculiarities can result in repeat offenders of, you could say, male on female violence receiving light sentences, and victims have to go through a purification process before they're able to be readmitted to society. Ultimately, modernity is downstream from numerous sources. Will has another video showing a compelling case for how modernity can take these traits from medieval Judaism, Jewish messianism, and also argued by Jewish scholars such as Agatha Balik-Robson and Yuri Slezkine. One of the vehicles for this transformation happened in the confluence with Protestantism. Przywara has in places forcefully argued that Protestantism, as well as Immanuel Kant, are among those composites of theopanism and pantheism. And since his death in the late 60s, modernity has broken off to a greater degree from its American Protestant roots, becoming what we might call today a cargo cult of Protestant ideals. The approach to earning wages as itself an ethical mission, the bifurcation of this ethical arrangement from salvation. It shows how this recent confusion, this allegedly recent confusion, has a precisely modern origin in the 16th century. Similarly, the critique of human reason has also insisted on a have your cake and eat it too mentality. Protestantism can be credited for making infallible the human conscience, itself a function of reason, as I mentioned earlier to Will's question, while also denigrating human reason to be nothing more than a blurry and buzzing mess. Salvation can be assured by our personal reason, but our personal reason cannot be trusted in any affair save for this single exception. Both, of course, carry over into modernity with little change. Hard work is culturally prized, but it's rarely rewarded, fair wages being a function of negotiation and not merit. Likewise, reason is for all practical purposes afforded the highest authority, especially in science. However, reason is also glibly derided as a useful tool for reptile-brained hairless primates. Certainly a picture by this point has been portrayed of modernity's multiple personalities. So I'd like to revisit part of Przywara's criticism of Hans Urs von Balthasar. Balthasar, therefore, logically says no to the origin of pneumatic ascent and to the dissolution of the earthly form of the image into pure spirit, but he says yes to the origin of the Dionysian vitality of an earthly life and fire. I read this much from Przywara already, and perhaps we can see now where his criticisms hit von Balthasar's theology. He has some more to say on origin here, however, going on. One of the growth of the Christian is a God in becoming, and thus already likened unto God. The growth proper to deification thus occurs as growth in the signs of the Logos and the Pneuma, and thus as an increasing spiritualization to the point that in origin, the visibility and sacramentality of the church appear as provisional to a breakthrough to pure spirit, this being the foundation of Joachim's Ecclesia Spiritualis and the entire Joachimite tradition. We'll follow up on Joachim in just a second, but it'll be appropriate here to hone in on where origin fits into the situation. Few Christian theologians have as much of a gravitational pull as Origen of Alexandria. He and Plotinus were students of the same teacher, and historians group them together in a loosely defined Neoplatonist school, which permeates Alexandria at this time. Plotinus and Neoplatonism don't fit into this category that Origen fits into, of being a composite between theopanism and pantheism, although Origen certainly does, owing to the synthesis of his sources. So Tertullian once asked famously, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? And to this, the scholar Philip Johnson remarked, Alexandria has to do with both. Alexandria had the largest populations of Jews outside of Israel in the first century, and is such of a critical interest to early Christianity, it would suit well for a future video all on its own. Origen's contributions to the Alexandrian philosophy at this time are, however, watershed. He was not only a major Christian theologian, but his philosophy also occurs among later Alexandrian authors up until paganism itself disappears from the empire in the 5th and 6th centuries. In many ways, he was among the first systematic thinkers, Christian or otherwise. Origen synthesizes a few major strains of philosophy as well as Christian and Jewish theology. Platonism, Aristotelianism, and Stoicism play a prominent role for his philosophy, as one would expect from his Greek upbringing. However, Origen also draws on other possibly groundbreaking Alexandrian philosophers, including the very prominent first-century philosopher Philo Judaeus, or Philo of Alexandria. Origen's use of Philo, a Hellenized Jewish thinker, becomes normative for centuries thereafter. Philo's own exegetical project bears such remarkable similarities to Christianity that he is often described as an honorary Christian or even an honorary church father. Origen, of course, is better known today as the cause, so to speak, of multiple crises in the church, some bearing his name and most being developments from his most attentive disciples. He is by many 4th century polemicists called the so-called father of Arianism, and later conciliary condemnations during the Second Origenist crisis. They cast a long shadow over his work. There's been attempts to reconcile Origen, he obviously, his intellect and his a very attractive allegorical exegesis can not really be denied, and they've persisted throughout Christian history. Now, his most notable critics were actually former admirers, such as St. Jerome and St. Maximus Confessor. However, his most successful critics were those who helped mend his theology to conciliar standards. St. Gregor the Theologian and St. Maximus are both examples of Origenists who went to great lengths to retrofit and really clean up Origenism to Christian orthodoxy. Now, if you're at all unfamiliar with Origen's most notable doctrines, you should be able to see how these fit into theopanism and pantheism with some ease. Or familiar, rather. Origen was certainly a doctor of spiritualism, and his doctrine of pre-existent souls was the basis for his condemnation. The idea of souls being spherical and pre-existent in inhabiting bodies or descending down into bodies. Origen's related, and if not more obscure, doctrine of universal salvation also ties into his belief in all souls originating from a primeval eternity, descending down into matter in an archetypal fall. Origen's emphasis on spirit also rendered his hermeneutics an object of suspicion. His allegorical interpretations were not unusual at the time, and they were not always regarded with suspicion. Origen assigned, however, a primary intention to the spiritual or moral interpretation that the original events become occluded to their actual reality. This is the basis, for instance, where he reads about, in Genesis, the clothes of animal skins that God gives to Adam and Eve. As he reads that as clothes of flesh from the descent of pre-existent souls into matter. And there's not much of a historical basis for such a claim otherwise. Much of Origen's most contentious doctrines belong to this mystagogy that he refused to teach directly or openly. Now, Origen was not Gnostic. He's not categorically Gnostic, and he's not originally Gnostic. He was, in fact, a reputable opponent of Gnostics for many years. This much does not exculpate Origen from the fact of his redemptive cycle, which gives faith a quality akin to an unleashing of psychical freedom and esotericism and gnosis. Universal salvation, for instance, was not taught except to the learned. His most controversial text on first principles was also not circulated except among Alexandrian philosophers, while his main work remained scriptural exegesis, like Philo Judaeus, who he takes as one of his principal authorities. Another rather influential doctrine of Origen, which perhaps most nurtured the coming crisis in the 4th century of Arianism, was his unique doctrine of theosis. Theosis is not a new concept in Christianity, but the process was almost univocal in Origen between the Word of God and the spirits returning to God the Father from after the fall. In his dialogue with Heraclitus, the interlocutor asks Origen, "There's two gods?" And after being confronted with both the Father and the Son being God, Origen answers, "Yes, the power is one." The distinction made in other works between God and his powers, as well as the powers from other powers, situates this constellation of subordinate creatures produced by God under not dissimilar conditions to the Son of God. Origen's theosis is wrought on the Son from all eternity and on man by a like process, the capacity of life to burn in rhythmic union with the Father. Thus we have Przywara's own dichotomy. The pneumatic ascent and progress ad infinitum is Origen's narrative on pre-existent souls and eschatology of a kind. And the life and fire, the closed finitude of a creature's telos, is fulfilled in every moment of its self-moved life. It's the theosis of the everyday. It's the working of a life power in the moment to moment. Now, as promised, we can now take a look at Abbot Joachim and the way that he fits into an Origenism as well. Now, Przywara finds Joachim and Origen to have such similar theological horizons that he links them genetically. The question of the influence, I think, is an interesting one, but we can leave that aside for at least the time being to look at how they function in virtually the same way and how Joachim is received both East and West to produce more or less the same outcomes. Joachimism is a development of Origenism, since for Origen, the way of salvation is one of increasing spiritualization, even to the point of an ideal dissolution of the visible forms of the new covenant into pure spirit, though as of yet, without the explicit distinction of the three stages proposed by Joachim. Conversely, modern Russian Trinitarian gnosis is a development of Joachimism. Przywara is referring to a school of Russian Orthodox theologians, which finds its perfection in the highly sophisticated sophiology of Father Sergei Bulgakov. Bulgakov was at the times treated with some suspicion by superiors, though his influence has grown considerably to the present day. At the monasteries, Bulgakov's sophiology is what reigns supreme. Back to Przywara. Since Joachim depicts his tritheism as the principle of history, whereas in the case of modern Russian Trinitarian gnosis, it amounts to a fundamentally speculative theory that conceives of the Trinity as the principle of a divine history. Within this continuum, Abbot Joachim represents a definite midpoint in the peculiar development of the Eastern. Seen thus, it is a theopanistic, cosmological pneumaticism. Przywara at this point commends the theopanism of Joachim as a resounding influence in Eastern Orthodox theology, elsewhere depicting their peculiar doctrines such as the energetic procession and eternal manifestation as dependent on the Holy Spirit being a point of unity, the telos, the completion of divine history for Eastern Orthodox theology. He goes on to the pantheistic side of Joachim, which so preoccupied the West, to say, viewed from the other side, however, this same Joachimism stands essentially within the history of Western spiritualism, which is similarly rooted in Origen, but in an Origen whose path to salvation as one of spiritualization is interpreted in personalistic fashion. From this perspective, we see that the rise of the Franciscan spirituals and the Trinitarian spiritualism of Meister Eckhart from the spirituals in Meister Eckhart, however, this radical development continues unimpeded to the Reformation, to Jansenism, and to German idealism. So finding here a Joachimism that prospers and mutates as it comes into contact with its foreign agents. Abbot Joachim thus appears from this perspective as the turning point in the particular development of the Western. It is, in this respect, a pantheistic, personalistic spiritualism. So between East and West, therefore, there's this common process. Joachim represents an increasing spiritualization. For the East, this is a process from Father to Son to Holy Spirit that is itself a history, the Spirit finally acting as the unifying principle of this so-called divine history. For the West, this is a process within creation of Father to Son to Holy Spirit that is itself purely history. It's a divine history, but mainly a history, with the reign of the Holy Spirit guiding creation to its telos in God and completing as, once more, a principle of unity for the cosmos and for God himself. We should again be reminded that despite being such a widely received theologian, Joachim was condemned at the Fourth Lateran and is determined to be a quite foul example of what happens when you dispose of the Analogia Entis. Remember what Aquinas had to say about Abbot Joachim. He doesn't think that you could be very intelligent and then regard his theology as anything convincing. So Przywara's axiom, which he takes from the Fourth Lateran, I hope you didn't forget it, about the ever greater dissimilarity between God and creatures, is the very inverse of Joachimism. Quite literally, every one of these errors discussed by Przywara. The basis for his principal error, the univocity between the Word's unity with the Father and our unity with the Word, is centered on this single passage from the Gospel of John, that they may all be one, even as thou, Father, art in me and I in thee. At fourth Lateran, the condemnation comes to Joachim for failing to distinguish that the unity of the Word and the Father is by nature, our unity with the Father is by grace. The confusion, therefore, can be put another way. The confusion of nature and grace is always accompanied with this veering into theopanism and pantheism. The supernatural perfects the natural is open to the supernatural. Thus, when we come again to Eastern theologians like Bulgakov, we quickly find that such distinctions are rendered hopelessly impotent. Bulgakov's own project is, however, the most well-regarded from the East. It's, again, very sophisticated and very well-ordered, even if it does fall into theopanism. The more basic failures, such as those of Vladimir Lossky and neo-Kantianism, which masquerades under Gregory Palamas, retains these worst impulses from Kant without any of the forethought of Bulgakov. Lossky, Florovsky, a few other figures that coalesce into a sort of neo-Palamite position. On the side of Catholics, Joachim stirred up many among the monastic orders, especially the highly regarded German theologian Meister Eckhart. Eckhart is a Dominican and was for a time a prime competitor alongside Thomas Aquinas as their so-called original doctor. Aquinas won out, not least because he's actually following the tradition, unlike Eckhart's spiritual mysticism and his obvious Joachimite tendencies. On the side of the Franciscans, the so-called spiritual Franciscans consistently brought papal scrutiny upon themselves for their adoption of these Joachimite positions about the papacy and about in their mystical practices. Pierre de Jean Olivier, who's among the first Franciscan chairs of theology, is noted for this very problem, among a few others. Joachim's process of history in the Trinity is the process of Trinity in history, and these reflect both a merging of the immanent and economic act of God into one object. The secondary object of creation is so likened to the primary object of creation that the similarity is dissolved or completely obliterated. As God becomes a spirit through the Trinitarian processions, Joachim has the world becoming spirit in the historical process of 3 ages. Then as wisdom and mystic ascent, the church itself as the body of Christ is at all times above history. So also does it only exist within history, and thus even the wisdom and mysticism only ever presides on the human interests and human goals. So this is the merging of 2 visions of the church. A church which is so transcendent that its very history is a divine-driven history, and a church which is so immanent that it is a historical vehicle with a historical mission only. The former view would obviously never accept a pope, because a pope would have to be so positively willed by God that he would have to be as much of an apostle as St. Paul. The latter view would also obviously never accept a pope, because a pope becomes a worldly potentate like any other, and he has no final rights or authority. The church in the present moment is either so endowed with a divine perfection it becomes an impossibility, or it is so humanly configured it is at one power among many. I trust now the errors of Joachim appear to be more evident, and we're approaching the final purpose of the Analogia Entis. I do want to mention that this vision for why the Analogia Entis is a decisive Catholic form here is alluding to the First Vatican Council. The ability to accept a pope as capable of being infallible but not always infallible is itself a distinction that is derivative from this view of this distinction that's to take place between a purely divine or a purely human vicar of Christ. The tendencies towards theopanism and pantheism to some degrees are unavoidable. The only true bulwark against the natural veering into one or another error is the form of the Analogia Entis. Even with the composites we have seen, it is not enough to have polarities, because polarities enter into competition when their complementarity disappears. If they take up the same ground, they become adversarial. Przywara observes that this theopanism and pantheism recurs throughout the Catholic tradition, but the preference of the one to the other does not overtake the Analogia Entis if the Analogia Entis is held as sacrosanct, as the fundamental Catholic form. So he goes to say that Aquinas himself has, to some extent, he has a tendency, or he can be very easily taken into a theopanist territory. And likewise with Duns Scotus, he can very easily be taken into pantheist territory by some of their successors. but only because they remain within the boundaries of Catholic tradition, rooted in Scripture, do they escape this, you could say, Scylla and Charybdis on either side. Now, if the analogy of being safeguards the distinction of creator and creature, then the concrete church is the safeguard of the safeguard. Grace ensures that the dissimilarity of God and creature remains intact. The liturgy professes this much with the corporate sacrifice surrounded by all the sacred signs. For Przywara, the visible church retains the divinely given form that preserves revelation and unfolds it in every fresh moment. We cannot help but be creatures of our moment, and the church for us exists in the current moment. It is only in the church that the church is maintained. We might want to project our present ideas upon the church of the past. We might want to dispose of the past to make way to the future. The desire to bend the law of faith to our wishes or to efface the law altogether is the most formal act of heresy. The form of all heresy for Przywara exists in this form. It is to approach this composite of theopanism and pantheism in both respects, to repeat the most primordial temptation, to become like God, to want free possession of all things, including oneself. This is the reason the relation between polarities is so important. The vision of a reciprocal relation pictured here between God and creatures, to dispose of the Analogia Entis, is the want to grasp the invisible and omnipotent God with our hands, to own him. That is idolatry. Every distortion of the faith, from antiquity to modernity, does not merely dispute this or that teaching of the church. The church simply stands in the way of the individual's effort to lay hold of the Godhead. The form of heresy is the first sin. Theopanism and pantheism are respective sides of the first sin of Adam and Eve. In light of this, with the category of Reformation in mind as a composite of theopanism and pantheism, Przywara delivers this penetrating judgment. In this respect, however, the Reformation is simply the form in which the most formal form of all heresies becomes manifest. This is implicit in the two words for heresy, heresy and ketzerai. Przywara here is leveraging two loan words from Greek into the German to establish his diagnosis. He goes into the philology here. Heresy, which comes from eresis, signifies one's own personal choice, in which everything objective stands as something relatively selectable over against the selecting will, understood as the site and instrument of the absolute, choice over against the objective, and not service within the objective. The one who chooses absolutely thus takes up a position over against the objective as a tragic individual. Ketzerai, on the other hand, which comes from katharos, signifies the orientation to an absolute purity, which God alone possesses and is, in contrast to every human admixture. It is a separating of oneself from the humanity of human forms for the sake of an immediacy to the absolutely pure, while heresy signifies the act, ketzerai signifies the corresponding object. Notice here how Przywara distinguishes heresy as the act or theopanist aspect from the ketzerai as the object or pantheist aspect. The result is this composite, and all composites of pantheism and theopanism approach this, in Przywara's words, formal form. It is precisely here, therefore, that we see the formal form of original sin. Its like God is found at the level of its act in heresy, understood as absolute choice, and at the level of its object in ketzerai, understood as the absolutely pure, an absolute orientation of the absolute to the absolute. Its knowledge of good and evil is found at the level of its act in heresy, understood as reflexively conscious choice at the level of its object, in ketzerai understood as the content that is purified by examination. And in this sense, it is also the biting of the apple, the tragic of a fall from the divine sphere of the absolutely pure into naturalism, since an unfettered naturalistic passion was already the more profound dimension within absolute choice. Przywara recognizes here two distinct activities within the fall. Adam sins and Eve sins. Obviously, there's one original sin, but both of them contribute to it. Eve gazes upon the fruit and finds it pleasing, beholds it, grasps it, and eats it. She sees and chooses for herself. Adam, conversely, stands beside Eve and, in a sense, abdicates his role as husband towards her. Once he sees that it is good to eat, he partakes himself, separating himself from his humanity to transcend into the divine, away from his human responsibilities. And so Przywara concludes, For precisely this reason, all forms of heresy are, in the final analysis, not a breaking away from a given particular Christian content, but rather a breaking with the Christian as such, with God as such, the logical conclusion of which is that it assumes the form of a pure naturalism and of the Dionysian. So the Catholic Church, the only concrete and direct manifestation of Jesus Christ, is the only way to overcome the original, like God, of original sin. Grace is the divine help. With the divine help, we can overcome original sin and enter into eternal life. And truly, the Church is the one place where the Analogia Entis is maintained because its profession, the kerygma, is to pronounce the end of the Analogia Entis. Yes, the Analogia Entis itself, as a fundamental Catholic form, is the distinction of creator and creature. It is the only mode to understand the astounding fact of the gospel, that the Word of the God took on human flesh and dwelt among us. The incarnation is properly professed only when the Analogia Entis is in place, because it is precisely the overcoming of the analogy in the Analogia Entis, by itself another analogy. The analogy, as we saw at the very beginning, in the very first quote, between the divine nature and human nature in Jesus Christ. Now recall our motto throughout this video, the relationship between God and creation. This is the way to visualize what happens in the incarnation. God enters creation in a kind of exitus of his own in the form of a servant. God as such brings creation into himself, a kind of reductus, or creation to himself, so that the creation can take on the form of God. This is the meaning of St. Athanasius saying, God became man so that man could become God. The mutual indwelling of humanity in Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ in humanity, brings about a new order in which our relationship to God is illuminated, personal, and even, in a sense, reciprocal. Yes, indeed, when the Word takes on a human nature, he becomes himself a person with two natures, in the Godhead and in humanity. The distinction between Godhead and created natures remains. That aspect of the Analogia Entis does not change. It is a permanent fixture. But the Word becoming flesh means that he is composite of divine and human forms, a composite person to that extent. This doesn't mean Jesus is an additional person formed by the two natures, constructed by the Word in a predestined human being. It means that the Word is truly God and now truly man. Jesus Christ, God, Jesus Christ as man. Two principles in the same phrase, God-man. The consequence has two dimensions or two aspects. On our side, as creatures, our human nature, and really all created nature, is consecrated with the activity of God as man. This is called in the tradition the communicatio idiomatum, the communication of idioms. We can translate it less literally as the agreement or concordance of properties. This means that the pre-existent Word, who is above category and genus, in taking on a human nature, shares with us this human nature. By this mode, by his human nature, we have a univocal relationship with God. God's goodness, according to his humanity, can be attained according to our humanity as well, with the divine help. You might be asking what's special about this. Well, think about it. Think about the fact that in one God, the two natures do not conflict. They agree. God's goodness is only ever analogous to our own in the analogy of being. We can be good in a similar way to how other humans can be good, or how a watch can be good, or a sandwich can be good, according to the fact that it's a watch or a sandwich. Yet, what we call good is only to say that it pre-exists in God. It is dissimilar to God's own goodness. But in Christ, the divine perfections are communicated. They are in agreement with his human participation in the divine perfections. This means that in Christ, moral goodness concurs with the divine goodness. And so for those who are in Christ, within Christ, their moral goodness can also concur with the divine goodness. By this measure alone can we have univocity or univocal predication with God. Now, the analogy of being remains a formal structure for this. Remember, it is not like Joachim's misattribution of John's gospel. The analogy remains between what is created and what is not created. The unity of God is not our unity with Christ. However, the relationship is changed such that the analogy is now within the divine person of the Word. The polarity is now a personal polarity, wherein dissimilarity is overcome with the identity of the one person of Jesus, God the Word. Now, on the side of creator, Przywara employs his own term, or he uses his own technical term, which is commercium, for the way that this relationship is meted out. The commercium, or exchange, between God and creatures highlights the analogy of being while also demonstrating the means by which God breaks through it. We receive the communicato idiomatum, in which we're able to participate in Jesus' divinized humanity by being, in St. Paul's words, knit together in his holy church, joint and ligament, member to member. The gift of participation in the divine nature, the gift of the sacraments by which we gain this participation, is given to us in the economy of salvation in the exchange of the incarnation. But God in return receives from us the form of the servant. He receives from us the likeness of sinful flesh, the curse of the law, the suffering and death that we deserve on account of our sin. The commercium, therefore, is that we get everything. We obtain everything to the highest gift imaginable, the gift of divinization. But God, in a sense, receives nothing. Przywara goes as far as to say, in a provocative passage, that God, in a sense, dies for nothing, insofar as he dies for no profit of his own. The only thing that he gains is glory, communicating to us. That is a strictly benefit to us. For him, there is no profit to be gained. It's merely an addition. Something that is not merely profitable, something we're not giving something back to him that he didn't already have. Surely he dies for something. He receives glory, adopted sons, he reveals himself and is known, but he doesn't need any of that. He is blessed with or without it. And this is what makes it true agape. This is what makes it the love of God, that he would die for us, not to fix his emotional state, but in a truly dispassionate passion. He dies for no wages. He raises us up only for our sake. It is truly wanting the best for us. Now, in the same polarity, Przywara observes the commercium in the whole economy of salvation. Now, recall to mind the Augustinian axiom, the old covenant conceals the new covenant reveals the old. For on the one side of the old covenant is the condemnation, the dialectic of clean and unclean, the identification of sin, the curse of the law, the context for the coming incarnation. On the side of the new is the freedom from condemnation, tearing down of the walls, wiping out of sin, blessing faith, the blessing of faith, and the fulfillment of the law. The old covenant is the means by which God accepts the curse of the law, and the words of St. Paul even become sin or sin offering, and puts to death the entire old cosmos. The new covenant is the means by which God raises up all of those who are under the curse into the blessing of the promise, into a life of grace and truth, and restores the fallen cosmos into a state even better than it had been from the first. As St. Thomas identifies, this is the path of grace. The sacraments are empowered and are from the crucifixion, while the sacraments are destined and are toward the resurrection. My own contribution to this is that the myths that we observed earlier from either side of act and object are completely inverted in the Passion and Resurrection. The fall of Phaeton, remember, is this tragic and involuntary fall, a revolution in the heavens which it begs to be fixed by our own efforts. This is replaced with the words voluntary descent into our fallen world, raised up on the cross by our own terrible sin, and he's seated on his throne out of pity for us. The other side, the Dionysian being torn apart into pieces and then grown out of one of those members, is completely overturned by the resurrection. Jesus turns the many members into one, for he is the true vine, with the many grapes being the one in his chalice, the many grains becoming the one bread of life. So the analogy of being is always oriented towards, or rather is for the sake of, the incarnation. So says Aquinas himself in a passage often referenced by Father Przywara. So the potency of a creature to receive is of two kinds. One is natural. This can be entirely fulfilled because it extends only to natural perfections. The other is obediential potency, inasmuch as it can receive something from God. And such a capacity cannot be filled because whatever God does with a creature, it still remains in potency to receive from God. See here this phrase, obediential potency. In many ways, this is the creature's receptiveness to glory, something God intended in making us. This is why the Catholic Church praises the Blessed Mother so highly as being the archetype for this obediential potency. Przywara, at least in what is recorded in a letter from Karl Barth to his fellow theologian and dialectical theologian, Edward Turneyson, is alleged to have agreed with Barth's proposition that one could, instead of saying Analogia Entis, simply say Mary. Her obedience is the fulfillment of the obediential potency of the creature, concomitant to the obedience of Christ unto death on the cross. The Analogia Entis is expressed by this phrase. It is the potency for incarnation and divinization, the form in which both make sense. It gives the incarnation something to overcome, It is what grace perfects. The darkness of analogy by another dark analogy becomes the light of truest revelation. I'd like to read one of Przywara's more obscure, but I think poetic passages on this overcoming of analogy. I'll try to interject here where I believe it necessary, but I think that this is a pretty magnificent explanation. The analogy of an ever greater dissimilarity within a similarity, however great, finally appears as an analogy of night. The night of a pure, religiously understood essentialism is emphatically night as light, leading to the ever so great of an increasing illumination in God, who is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. Przywara is saying that on the side of the creator or on the side of act, the night appears to us as a darkness, a mystery of impenetrable darkness that can only be seen through negation and therefore only encountered through dissimilarity. Yet we know nonetheless that this is an unapproachable light. It's unapproachable and eternal light, a light so pure that it cannot be seen. So in the darkness, it is a dazzling darkness, a light beyond light, from which all light derives. Przywara continues in the inverse. The night of a pure, religiously understood existentialism is an emphatically light as night, leading to the ever greater of an increasing participation in the night of God's marriage on the cross, as the night of God being forsaken by God. Our sufferings, our finitude, and most of all our sins dampen our ability to see God, and so God in the Passion experiences this, what you could call, in a sense, God-forsakenness, our humiliation and our weakness in taking upon himself the curse of the law, the death owed to us for sin by bearing all of our sorrows. By this, he marries the church as a high priest who can sympathize with us by bringing us to himself, even in our profound desolation. He never ceases in being God, but he experiences what we experience in being forsaken by God. So Przywara continues, what is ultimate in analogy is thus not the night of an ever greater dissimilarity. Rather, what is really decidedly ultimate is an analogy of night that itself consists in an analogy. Now, listen carefully as Przywara explains this analogy within the analogy. This can be a little confusing. Please pay attention. He writes, in which the night of God's going out into the night of the most real night of the creature and of the creature's participation in this night is what is ever greater. So what is ever greater is the incarnation, specifically the encounter on the cross between God and the God-forsaken experience of mystery and death going on, passing right through the however great of God's night as an excess of his light and of the night of the creature's blindness in this light, because the actual being of God is that agape that gives soul and life for brothers and sisters. This is the analogy of Christ's humanity to Christ's divinity, the communication of idioms in the commercium of the cross. The incarnation overcomes the darkness of the Analogia Entis in apophatic theology, and it institutes a new order of univocity. The creator becomes like his creatures by taking on a human nature. God became like us so that we can become like him. This only makes sense. It only has its full meaning and possibility by maintaining the Analogia Entis. The incarnation is foolishness to the pagans because they believe that God is all or all is God. The incarnation is a scandal to the Jews because the Analogia Entis is impossible in that theology, and so therefore the incarnation is as well. The fact of incarnation is in its truest expression commenced as an analogy within the Analogia Entis, which coherently grants creatures an actual change, creatures becoming like the unlike God because the unlike God became like them. Before we conclude, I'd like to mention a few notes on Przywara's life after his work in 1932 on the Analogia Entis. It'll help us to understand his legacy better, why it's so fought over, and especially why he's often pitched next to Hans von Balthasar. I've gone to great lengths to establish Przywara's positive case for the Analogia Entis, and we'll have a look in the next video on how it's received in von Balthasar and how it's disrupted. So first, we should understand that Jesuits in Germany suppressed to one degree or another throughout Przywara's life, but the crackdown on the order was most severe in the more than a decade period following the publication of Analogia Entis between 1935 and 1950. Przywara he dutifully remained in Munich. That's where he was stationed throughout his life. And ironically enough, Munich happened to be where the National Socialist headquarters is also located. He was confined to small quarters. He was frequented by the Gestapo who were tracking his movements, preventing it from writing or lecturing much at all or offering the mass. It's also recorded that Himmler, the head of the SS, investigated Przywara personally when he was giving underground lectures. You might sympathize with Himmler's conclusion that Przywara was too lofty to be considered seditious. Nonetheless, Przywara wasn't able to work much at all, and his publications ground to a near halt with the shutting down of the Jesuit publication that he was an editor for. This was one of the prime periods in a priest's career for this to be shut down. He could scarcely feed himself. And even as the war came to a close in the mid-40s, he was already moving from place to place, said to have moved 11 times, and in the care of different nurses. He became extremely paranoid, depressed, frequently ill. By some accounts, he was incapacitated. And whenever he began to recover, he worked himself back into an exhaustion, and he made very little permanent progress. Von Balthasar during this time was one of the many who actually tried to help him, though Przywara's relationship to him was always very strained. Von Balthasar tried to get him out of Munich during the war into Switzerland, where von Balthasar actually was for some years. Przywara only left Germany after the war was over, while the Jesuits were still suppressed, but he returned shortly afterward, once the threat of retaliation by the Allies had gone. Przywara was under some scrutiny, and he struggled to get published after the war. Regardless, he had not really condemned National Socialism any more than some moderate resistance and infrequent intellectual criticism. This is sometimes discussed in journals today. He wrote to Carl Schmitt personally several times. He lamented that they were more or less similar situations and that it was impossible for him to get published because of this guilt by association. And the post-war narratives that were being constructed, Przywara's perspectives on key issues, obviously regarding nationalism and Jewish messianism, had him on the outs, despite his otherwise friendly relationship with ethnic Jews like Stein, Husserl, and Beck, having correspondence with them. So by the 50s, with the help of several longtime friends and students, including Hans-Urs von Balthasar, he actually began to publish again with some of his works adapting to the post-war climate. He wasn't necessarily writing what you might imagine be pre-Vatican II ecumenical articles praising all the enemies of the church, but they certainly weren't in the same derisive tone or the same critical tone that he had before. In his health declining again, he never recovered completely, and his struggles with flare-ups of cognitive decline worsened over time. So by the end of his life, he wasn't able to resist this picture and the picture that we saw at the beginning. These are the only real pictures that actually existed of the man during his lifetime. So his health declining in the lead up to Vatican II, he was already officially retired. He wasn't present to actually say anything much about it, and he passed shortly after the council. So despite the actual reception of Przywara being mixed, he was never really unreservedly criticized, save for those controversial writings that we've looked at in depth and for obvious reasons. The main battle over his legacy has been between Rahner, Piper, and von Balthasar. At their funeral, it was almost like a competition of who can heap the most praises on Przywara and who can make him their prototype. But this is only recognizable now as a bid to control his legacy, such that today he's rarely retrieved or systematically studied outside of these figures. Again, von Balthasar is the most popular, but there are biographical works that relate more to Rahner or Piper. And so we have the lasting dissimilarity between these two figures of Przywara and his student Hans-Urs von Balthasar. So as an emblem for their relationship, Przywara lived in Munich or near Munich for most of his life, and he remained a Jesuit until his death. Von Balthasar left Munich before the war and made his fortunes elsewhere, in Rome and beyond. And he always felt constrained by the Jesuit order, and he eventually left the order and was released from his vows in 1950. So when we see Przywara's lifelong dedication to the Analogia Entis as the distinctive and really the fundamental Catholic form, we might see how von Balthasar approached it with an apparent wish to leverage it into a more complete ecumenical vehicle. It is not simply the Analogia Entis, but the Analogia Entis for the modern church. And finally, we can appreciate what their criticisms of each other are. Przywara's words on Balthasar with regards to his Dionysian comments refers to von Balthasar emphasizing this pantheism at this stage in his career, even before he starts publishing his works on Theodramatique, Glory of the Lord, and his work with the mystic Adrian von Speer. Certainly this may have changed since he wrote that critique, in that it might become more incisive. And one comment he makes in his final sermons during the war is that is what we'll revisit in the subsequent analysis of von Balthasar. Now, von Balthasar's own criticism of Przywara, as scarce as it was, is also very illuminating. Again, he says he views Przywara's Analogia Entis as not being capable of supporting a complete Christology. So what does that mean, given what Przywara said about Hans-Urs von Balthasar? We saw more or less how Przywara's Christology emerges from his Analogia Entis, even how it posits within itself the commercium, the exitus reductus. But if we take another look at our schema of theopanism and pantheism, it will become more evident that this dichotomy of theopanism and pantheism, with some of these categories that we've looked at since we first saw this dichotomy, fits well with this idea that the Analogia Entis, when it's fulfilled in Christology, it requires still the dissimilarity between the two, and that these pantheism bends that we find in Hans-Urs von Balthasar and the theodrama, the theologic, and all of these cannot sustain a proper Analogia Entis. Theopanism is a philosophy of essence and makes it primary. Pantheism is a philosophy of existence and makes it primary. Theopanism, in its most sophisticated modern forms, appears Kantian or like a child of German idealism. Pantheism, on the other hand, has traits reminiscent of Francis Bacon and at large logical positivism, which Przywara calls philosophies of measure and weight. Theopanism veers towards skepticism, rationalism, and finally dualism. Pantheism is methodologically materialist, empiricist, and thus monist. Theopanism, being akin to Eve's side of the first sin as a passive, receptive, and feminine aspect, though this side of the equation is more often the act, and thus it should be more masculine, but it's typically more on the side of Eve. While in pantheism, because it's akin to Adam's sin, it has an active, masculine, and often work-based mentality. It's ultimately the object being more feminine, and that's why it's prioritized. Theopanism emphasizes God's transcendence. Pantheism emphasizes God's immanence, though neither attain to God's greater dissimilarity. Of course, we saw already Theopanism typifying the fall of Phaeton, the immortal struggle in the heavens, pantheism typified in the sporagmos of Dionysus, and the mutilation of this universal body. And finally, Theopanism, consequently, is seeking a reunion with the first, the hidden intellectual gnosis, the dissolution of opposites. And pantheism, however, is the rupture of primordial unity into further multiplicity. It is not based on a hidden gnosis, but an evident fact of one multiplying into many. It is the theology of the necessary sundering, the orkenosis, the original multiplying of the one into many. So we ask again, how did Hans-Urs von Balthasar veer too far in the Dionysian? It is precisely how von Balthasar used the Analogia Entis to bring analogy into the Godhead for his own speculative theology. He uses analogy to find a basis for the incarnation in the immanent Trinity, the economic Trinity being the image, the form of the Trinity itself. This is exemplified in his theology of the orkenosis and the drama of God. God is history, and God having a history.
Well, Jay, that was truly the masterclass. I'm going to need to listen to this at least several times to fully grasp it and apply it. I think this is going to be a wellspring for my channel and for my own thinking on these subjects. It sounds like both of our wives are getting home. So next time, I think the tentative title will be Life and Fire in the Flow of the World, focusing on von Balthasar, as you've already addressed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. We'll take a look at Hans-Urs von Balthasar, the way that he uses analogy to springboard the orkenosis into the Godhead, and the way that he relates to several figures, including the mystic Adrian von Speer, who I mentioned a few times. The main project that Hans-Urs von Balthasar is engaging in, he's less than clear about it, but I think it becomes obvious if you study his work systematically.
Excellent. I truly hope that you'll consider publishing this presentation. I think it's definitely worthy. And so you told me that you recently found out that you're going to be publishing your first book. Is that correct?
Yes, on October 4th, my first book will be published. It's called The Invention of Work. It's looking at the Catholic and really the Christian theology of work, and analyzing how the structures of work that we currently abide in are very antithetical to the Catholic and the Christian vision of what labor properly is, much less work. I go through a couple recent encyclicals about it, such as Laborum Exercens, Laudato Si, and of course Rerum Novarum, and looking at how work can be better understood from a Catholic perspective. Of course, some of the information I talked about here, including taking some of Przywara's discussions of polarities, play a major role in my analysis.
Excellent. And you have a website of collected essays called motleycourt.com, correct?
Yep. Yes, sir. Essays, poems, all sorts of things that I put on there, if that's of interest to anybody.
And where will we be able to find your publication? That's very
It'll be going through KDP. It'll be on Amazon, available starting October 4th, and it'll be available in paperback first. It's only about 100 pages. It's going to be about like $5, so it'll be convenient to access, and then should have a Kindle version available before the end of the year.
Excellent. And I'll update the show description notes with that link once it does come available. Also, and I'll post a link too for your website if you want me to. And we will be doing a live Q&A sometime in the near future. Look again at the show description notes for the exact date and time, and it'll be hosted on my Substack channel sometime in the near future. So once this video is up, there'll be an announcement of a time and date, and we really look forward to fielding your questions, particularly Jay, and applying this model for understanding modern errors through the lens of theopanism and pantheism, Jewish messianism, etc. The assault on the law of non-contradiction in the Analogia Entis. So look forward to that, and really look forward to our next session, Jay. So thank you so much for being so generous with your time and sharing your work with us today. And God bless you.
And yeah, thank you for this opportunity. Well, I'm glad to be able to share this with you and with your audience. I think it should be very profitable, and I'm excited to talk more when we meet next.
Excellent. God bless you. See you later.
Yep, God bless.